Listen. The great walls fell, not with a roar, but with a sigh of collapsing timber and settling dust. After 10 years, the thirst for Ilium's ashes was finally quenched. On the beach, the Greeks' fires burned bright with a savage joy, their laughter raw against the backdrop of smoldering towers. They had their victory, their plunder, their stories. But for one man standing apart on the dark shore, the only story that remained was the one leading west, across the trackless deep. Odysseus felt the pull of Ithaca like a physical ache, a cord tied around his heart drawing taut. The image of his wife's face, blurred by a decade of memory, and the son who would be a stranger, were the only treasures he craved. While his men celebrated the war's end, his spirit had already begun the next, greater war. The journey home. The sea which had carried them to battle now presented itself as a vast and empty road, its destination hidden beyond the curve of the world. His black ships were loaded, not just with bronze and captive women, but with the immense, silent weight of the years spent beneath Troy's stubborn shadow. Each vessel carried ghosts of the fallen and the weary souls of the living. As the sails caught the morning breeze, the fleet slipped away from the continent of war. The cheers from the beach faded, replaced by the creak of timbers and the endless, whispering hiss of foam along the hulls. Odysseus stood at the prow, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky drank the sea. Behind him, the smoke of Troy merged with the clouds, a final funeral pyre. Ahead lay nothing but the gray-green expanse, a blank page upon which their fate would be written. The wind was fair, but it was a lonely wind, carrying no scent of pine or olive grove, only salt and distance. The journey, he knew in his bones, would not be measured in miles, but in endurance. The war had been a decade of clamor and blood. The voyage home promised a different, slower torment, the quiet gnawing. Passage of sun and star, the testing of spirit against the immense, patient indifference of the ocean. The real trial was just beginning. The first land they sighted was Ismarus, a stronghold of the Cicons. It rose from the shore, a tempting silhouette of walls and towers, and the sight ignited a familiar, brutal fire in the hearts of Odysseus's men. The war was over, but its habits were not. They fell upon the city with the practiced ease of veterans, a storm of bronze and fire. Resistance was swift and futile. Soon, the air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the richer, sweeter smell of plundered wine. The Cicons' wealth was hauled to the beaches, amphorae of dark wine, crates of finely woven cloth, and herds of sheep and cattle. Odysseus stood amidst the chaos, his voice a command lost in the roar of celebration. He urged immediate departure, his eyes scanning the inland hills where survivors had fled. The sea was safety, the land was a trap, but his words were drowned by the laughter of men who had survived Troy and saw no threat in a broken foe. They slaughtered the Cicons, sheep, and oxen on the beach, building great bonfires whose light danced on the wine-dark waves. They drank deeply from the captured stores, their songs of victory slurring into the night, believing the world still owed them its spoils. Dawn came not with a gentle light, but with a terrible clarity. As the Greeks slept among the empty wineskins, a low thunder grew from the hills. The Cicons had rallied their neighbors, and a fresh army swept down upon the beach in a tide of chariots and shouting men. The surprise was absolute. Sleep-heavy warriors were cut down before they could raise their shields. The sand, stained red with wine the night before, was now soaked with a darker vintage. Odysseus roared orders, his heart a cold stone in his chest, driving his men into a frantic, stumbling retreat towards the ships. They shoved their vessels into the surf under a hail of spears, each man hauling himself aboard with the strength of pure terror. From the receding deck, Odysseus watched the beach recede. The bonfires were now funeral pyres for his own men, their smoke a bitter column against the brightening sky. 6 men from every ship were lost, their voices silenced. Their journey ended before it had truly begun. The surviving crew rowed with a desperate, grieving rhythm, the joyous plunder in the hulls now feeling like a cursed weight. The sea, which had seemed a road home, now felt like a vast and hungry mouth. Their first lesson was learned in blood. The arrogance of victory was a luxury they could no longer afford. The war was behind them, but a new, more perilous struggle for survival had just begun. Then came the gray sea and the true emptiness. The violence of Ismarus faded astern, leaving behind a silence more profound than any battlefield's clamor. The world shrank to the wooden shell of the ship, the groan of the mast, and the ceaseless, rhythmless chant of the waves against the hull. Day bled into night and back into day with a monotonous precision that gnawed at the spirit. The sun was a pale coin in a bleached sky. The moon, a cold specter on water as dark and thick as oil. For the crew, the work of sailing became a mindless liturgy. They trimmed the sail, they pulled on the oars, they belayed the ever-seeping water. But their eyes grew hollow, fixed on the unbroken circle of horizon. The sea offered no landmarks, no respite, no end. It was a featureless plain in every direction, a mirror that reflected only their own deepening despair. Men who had faced the terrors of Troy without flinching found themselves unmanned by this vast, gentle nothingness. They spoke less, their laughter a dead sound. They slept fitfully, haunted not by nightmares of combat, but by dreams of their own rocky shores, of wives, faces they could no longer clearly recall. Odysseus bore the solitude of command. His watches were long and solitary, standing at the stern while his men slept. He watched the wake, a brief white scar on the ocean's skin that healed instantly behind them, leaving no trace of their passage. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that would shine over Ithaca, yet they seemed colder, more distant here. His thoughts were his only company, thoughts of Penelope's loom, of Telemachus's growth, of his father's orchards. These memories were the cords that kept him tethered to purpose, but in the gray expanse, they sometimes felt as insubstantial as the mist that clung to the water at dawn. This was the first real test, a trial not of muscle but of soul. The sea demanded nothing but endurance, offering nothing in return. It was a slow leaching of hope, a grinding down of will by the sheer, immense indifference of the world. The men felt their identities, forged in war, beginning to dissolve into the salt air. They were becoming creatures of the voyage itself, their pasts and futures swallowed by the present monotony. The gray sea taught them a terrible lesson, that after the fury of battle, the most formidable enemy was loneliness, and the most daunting battlefield was the empty, patient, endless deep. After an eternity of gray water, the sight of a green smudge on the horizon sent a jolt through the weary crew. It was not the rugged cliffs of home, but a low, sandy shore backed by gentle, rolling hills of vibrant, unfamiliar foliage. The air, as they drew nearer, carried a new scent, not salt and decay, but the sweet, heavy perfume of blooming things. A deep, sheltered bay offered calm anchorage, its water a startling, transparent blue over white sand. The men leaned over the rails, their hollow eyes alight with a fragile hope. Here, at last, was respite from the sea's relentless hunger. Odysseus, his caution hardened by Ismarus, ordered a careful approach. Only a single ship was brought into the bay, its keel grating softly on the sand. The rest remained offshore, watchful. His command was simple: find fresh water and scout the land. No plunder, no contact unless necessary. 3 men, chosen for their steadiness, were sent inland along a narrow stream that trickled from the hills. They disappeared into a grove of strange, broad-leafed trees, their forms swallowed by the dappled, green-gold light. The land was eerily tranquil. No birds called, no insects buzzed. The only sound was the gentle sigh of the wind through the leaves and the distant murmur of the sea. The very air seemed thicker, softer, slowing the pulse and quieting the mind. The scouts followed the stream to its source, a clear spring bubbling from mossy stones. As they drank, they noticed the fruit. It grew on low, creeping vines, pale and opalescent, shaped like a swollen tear. Its fragrance was intoxicating, a blend of honey, ripe fig, and something deeper, like forgotten dreams. They were not alone. Figures emerged from the trees, moving with a languid, graceful slowness. The Lotus Eaters were a gentle people, with soft eyes and smiling, unlined faces. They showed no fear, no hostility, only a calm curiosity. They offered handfuls of the pale fruit to the thirsty Greeks, their gestures welcoming and serene. The scouts, disarmed by the peace after so much violence and loneliness, accepted. The Lotus Eaters made no demands, asked no questions. They simply sat by the spring, their presence a soothing balm. The initial reception was one of silent, profound friendship, a wordless invitation to lay down burdens the scouts had carried for years. The fruit rested cool and heavy in their palms, its perfume promising a sweetness deeper than mere water, a forgetting more complete than sleep. The scouts tasted the fruit. Its flesh was cool and melted on the tongue like scented snow, flooding their senses with a wave of perfect, weightless peace. The memory of the sea's gray loneliness evaporated. The sharp ache for Ithaca, the grief for fallen comrades, the very names of their wives and children, all dissolved into a warm, golden haze. They smiled, their bodies relaxing onto the soft grass. The Lotus Eaters watched with gentle understanding, offering more. The men ate, and with each bite, the chains of memory and duty fell away. They were no longer weary warriors on a cursed voyage. They were simply beings in a sun-dappled moment, wanting nothing, regretting nothing, belonging entirely to this fragrant, timeless shore. Odysseus, aboard the ship, felt the unease grow with each passing hour. The scouts did not return. The sun climbed, then began its descent, painting the peaceful bay in hues of amber and rose. The silence from the land felt heavier than any storm's threat. Leaving strict orders with the crew, he took a handful of men and went ashore, following the stream's path with a hand on his sword hilt. The same profound quiet enveloped them, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. They found the spring, and there his worst suspicion took form. His men lay scattered on the bank like contented beasts. Their weapons were discarded, their armor cast aside. Their faces wore expressions of vacant, blissful serenity. One was weaving flower crowns with a childlike focus. Another simply stared at the shifting leaves above, a faint smile on his lips. When Odysseus called their names, they turned to him with eyes clear of all recognition, devoid of urgency or fear. They spoke, their voices slurred with pleasure, not of home or ship or danger, but of the softness of the grass, the sweetness of the lotus, the beauty of the endless afternoon. They pleaded not for rescue, but for him to stay, to taste, to forget. A cold horror settled in Odysseus's chest. This was no monster's violence, but something more insidious, a surrender of the self, a willing dissolution of all that made them men. He shouted orders, grabbing the nearest sailor by the arm. The man resisted with a dreamy, petulant strength, clinging to the earth. It became a brutal, ugly struggle, not against an enemy, but against the seductive pull of oblivion. Odysseus and his party hauled their comrades upright, dragging them through the grove as they wept and begged to remain. They were dead weight, their souls already anchored to that blissful shore. Back on the beach, the affected men were bound hand and foot with stout rope, their pleas now mournful wails. They were carried to the ships like sacks of grain and tied firmly to the rowing benches, their tears mixing with the salt spray. As the oars bit into the water, pulling them back into the vast, unforgiving sea, their cries were the most terrible sound Odysseus had yet heard, the sound of men being torn from a happiness deeper than home, returning to a world of memory, struggle, and pain. The quiet horror of the place lingered in the air long after the green shore faded into the haze, a reminder that the greatest perils were not always those that threatened the body, but those that annihilated the will. Days later, a new island shouldered its way out of the mist, a stark and rugged place of high cliffs and windswept meadows. Opposite it, across a narrow, churning strait, loomed a larger, darker coast, its shoreline obscured by a permanent haze of distant smoke. The island itself teemed with life. Wild goats, agile and countless, picked their way across the steep rocks, their bleating a constant chorus on the salt wind. It was a bounty, a stark contrast to the soul hunger of the Lotus Eaters. The fleet anchored in a sheltered cove, and the men fell upon the goats with a desperate gratitude. Fires were lit, and the air grew rich with the smell of roasting meat. For a day and a night they feasted and rested, their bellies full, their spirits momentarily lifted by this tangible, savage plenty. Yet Odysseus could not rest. His eyes were drawn incessantly across the dark water to the smoky mainland. Curiosity, that relentless engine of his spirit, burned. Within him, who lived there, what fires produced that constant haze? In the customs of the world he knew, strangers could be sources of guest gifts, tokens of honor that added to a hero's fame and wealth. The memory of empty hands from the Lotus Eaters sure rankled. Here was an opportunity, a chance to glean something more than mere sustenance from this wandering. The island's safety and abundance made the risk seem calculated, manageable. He announced his intention at dawn. He would take a single ship and 12 of his best men across the strait to explore. A murmur of dismay rippled through the crew. They pleaded with him, their voices edged with a superstitious fear. They had food, they had water, they had a safe harbor. Why tempt the unknown? Why not fill the holds with smoked goat meat and sail on, blessed by this fortune? Their words were sensible, born of the sea's harsh lessons. But Odysseus heard only the challenge, the siren call of the unexplored. He selected his dozen companions, the strongest, the bravest, the most loyal, and ignored the rising chorus of alarm. The chosen men rowed the small ship away from the comforting sight of their comrades and the bleeding goats. The crew left behind stood on the shore, watching them go with foreboding in their eyes, their earlier feasting forgotten. The strait was a rough, choppy passage, the current pulling at the oars. With each stroke, the safe island diminished, and the vast, smoky shore grew larger, more imposing, more silent. Odysseus stood in the prow, his gaze fixed ahead, driven by a fatal blend of curiosity, pride, and the unquenchable hope for a gift that would make the tale of this journey worth the telling. He sailed toward the smoke, leaving safety and sense behind, crossing a threshold from which there would be no simple return. The shore was a barren, rocky shelf beneath towering cliffs. No harbors welcomed them, only the thunder of surf against stone. They beached the ship on a narrow shingle, securing it with heavy stones, and climbed. The air grew thick with the smell of wood smoke and dung. At the cliff's base, they found it, a gaping mouth in the rock, tall as a temple entrance, wide enough to drive a wagon through. From within wafted the rich, pungent aroma of cheese and the animal warmth of penned beasts. They entered, their eyes adjusting to the dimness. The cave was a vast, high-ceilinged chamber, a natural fortress. Along its walls were stacked countless wicker baskets, bulging with creamy white cheeses. Pens held flocks of sheep and goats, their woolly backs shifting in the shadows. Pails and bowls, each large enough for a man to bathe in, stood brimming with whey. It was a trove of pastoral wealth, orderly and abundant, yet utterly deserted. The men's eyes gleamed with a hunter's avarice. They urged Odysseus to take what they could carry, the cheeses, the best of the lambs, and flee back to the ship and the safety of the island. A deep unease settled Odysseus's gut. This was no abandoned shepherd's hut. The scale was all wrong. The single milking stool was a log thicker than a man's torso. The fire pit in the center could have roasted an ox whole. He counseled patience, restraint. To steal from a host unseen was to invite the wrath of gods and men. Better to wait to meet the inhabitant, to offer greetings in the hope of receiving a guest gift. His words were logic, but they were also pride. He wanted the story, the encounter, the formal exchange. His men grumbled, but they obeyed, sampling the cheese with nervous greed as the hours crawled by. Then the earth trembled. A rhythmic, colossal thudding echoed from outside, growing nearer. A shadow fell across the cave mouth, blotting out the evening light. The men scrambled back into the deepest recesses, their faces pale with terror. Polyphemus ducked his great shaggy head and entered his home. He was a mountain of flesh and matted hair, a single, lidless eye gleaming like a polished plate of bronze in the center of his forehead. He drove his vast flocks inside with a rumble of command. Then, with a grunt of effort that shook dust from the ceiling, he lifted a massive boulder, a piece of the cliff itself, and set it against the entrance, sealing them in with a final, deafening thud. The sound was the sound of a tomb closing. In the firelight, the giant began his evening chores, utterly unaware of the tiny, trembling hearts hiding in the shadows of his domain. The giant's routine was methodical. He milked his ewes, the streams filling the huge pails to overflowing. Then he lit a fire, the flames leaping to illuminate the cavern's roof. It was then his single eye swept the shadows and found them. A low rumble, more curious than angry, echoed in his chest. He reached down with a hand the size of a ship's sail and plucked up two men as if they were squeaking mice. He dashed their heads against the stone floor with a wet, terrible crunch, then methodically tore them limb from limb, devouring them whole, flesh, bone, and marrow, washing the gruesome meal down with great gulps of milk. The remaining men huddled in mute horror, the sounds of cracking and chewing a nightmare chorus. Polyphemus then belched, stretched, and lay down among his sheep, his snores shaking the ground. Dawn brought no relief. The giant ate two more men for his morning meal, then rolled aside the boulder to let his flocks out, sealing the cave again as he left. The terrible rhythm of consumption was established. Odysseus watched his companions dwindle, their terror a cold stone in his own gut. He could not fight such strength directly. His mind, that clever instrument, began to work. Near the pens lay a giant olive-wood club, green and unsplit. Odysseus had his men sharpen its tip, hardening it in the fire until it gleamed like a weapon. He also found a skin of potent, dark wine he had brought from the ship, a gift for just such an encounter. When Polyphemus returned that evening and consumed two more of his men, Odysseus stepped forward. He offered the wine, speaking with forced calm. The giant took the skin, drained it in one long pull, and grunted in pleasure. The strong, unmixed liquor worked swiftly. His mood softened. He asked for more, and Odysseus obliged. A false friendliness bloomed in the drunken Cyclops. He asked the stranger's name. Odysseus, his heart a hammer against his ribs, replied, "Nobody. My name is Nobody." The giant laughed, a sound like rock slides, and promised to eat Nobody last as a guest gift. Then he toppled over, insensible, wine dribbling from his lips, his massive hand still clutching the empty skin. In the firelight, Odysseus gestured to his four remaining men. They took the sharpened stake, its point now glowing from the embers, and approached the monstrous head. The air smelled of wine, smoke, and terror. Odysseus positioned the point above the great, sleeping eye. The plan was set. The moment of terrible violence was at hand. The heated wood hissed faintly in the cool cave air, a promise of agony and the only hope of escape. They stood poised, a tiny band of mortals against a mountain of flesh, ready to blind the unseeing god. Odysseus drove the stake down with all his weight and strength, leaning into it like a sailor pushing an oar against a tidal surge. The heated point struck the giant's eye with a sickening, sizzling hiss, like meat dropped on a hot griddle. Polyphemus roared. It was a sound that tore from the roots of the mountain, a shattering bellow of pure, uncomprehending agony that shook the very walls of the cave. Cheese baskets toppled. Sheep bleated in panic. The giant's hands flew to his face, but Odysseus and his men, now a single organism of desperate will, seized the stake's end and bored it deeper, twisting it as a shipwright twists an auger into timber. The eye bubbled and popped, its fluid boiling around the wood. The stench of burning flesh and hair filled the There! Polyphemus convulsed, throwing them off. He staggered to his feet, blind and bellowing, clawing at the ruin of his face. He wrenched the stake free and flung it away, a smoking missile that clattered into the dark. His roars were now continuous, a seismic disturbance that echoed out through the sealed entrance. From the world outside came answering shouts, deep and rumbling like distant thunder. Other Cyclops, drawn by the commotion, gathered outside the great stone door. Their voices boomed questions through the rock. What ails you, Polyphemus? Why do you disturb our peaceful sleep with this shouting? Is someone stealing your flocks or trying to kill you by treachery? Gasping in pain, his hands pressed to his shattered eye, Polyphemus screamed back his reply. Nobody is hurting me. Nobody is killing me by treachery. The voices outside grumbled with annoyance. If nobody is harming you, one called back, the logic impeccable and maddening, then your pain is a sickness sent by Zeus. Pray to your father Poseidon and be quiet. Their heavy footsteps receded, leaving Polyphemus alone in his torment with the very nobody who had caused it. Odysseus and his men huddled among the terrified sheep, their hearts pounding, the giants' pained groans a constant soundtrack to their fragile hope. Dawn's gray light eventually seeped around the edges of the great door. Blinded and in agony, Polyphemus still attended to his routine. He rolled the boulder aside with a grating rumble, but now he sat in the opening, his massive hands outstretched, feeling the backs of each sheep and goat as they passed out to pasture. He intended to catch any man trying to escape. Odysseus saw the plan forming in the giant's mind. Working swiftly and silently, he lashed his remaining men beneath the bellies of the largest rams, using pliant willow withes from the giant's own bed to bind them tight to the thick, woolly fleece. For himself, he chose the greatest ram of the flock, the leader, and secured himself beneath its shaggy belly, his hands tangled in its wool. The animals began to file out. Polyphemus ran his hands over each back, checking for riders, but he felt only wool and the sturdy spines of his beasts. The ram carrying Odysseus went last, moving slowly. The giant, patting its sides, spoke to it, his voice a pitiful mix of pain and affection, wondering aloud why it, the leader, trailed behind today. It passed under his groping hands and out into the free air. Once at a safe distance, Odysseus cut himself and his men loose. They did not look back at the weeping giant in his cave mouth. They ran, a ragged, desperate band, down to the shore where their ship was hidden, driving a flock of the giant's best sheep before them, their freedom won by cunning and paid for in the blood of 6 companions. The ship was a flurry of frantic motion, men heaving the stolen sheep aboard, their hands trembling as they pushed the vessel from the shingle into the choppy strait. Oars bit the water, pulling them away from the cursed shore. A wild, giddy relief broke over them, laughter, tears, the clapping of backs. They were alive. They had outwitted a monster and taken his prize flock. The sun on the water seemed brighter, the air sweeter. They called to Odysseus, praising his cunning, their voices shrill with released terror. But Odysseus stood at the stern, his eyes fixed on the diminishing cave mouth. A cold, black stone of pride sat heavy in his chest. The victory felt hollow, incomplete, a tale half told. To escape was one thing, to let the monster believe he had been bested by a phantom called Nobody was another. He wanted the giant to know. He needed the name to echo in that ruined cavern, to be the last thing Polyphemus ever heard from the man who had taken his sight. It was a hero's vanity, a poison he could not resist. As the ship reached a safe distance, he raised his hands to his mouth, his voice powered by a lungful of sea. Air carried back to the shore with terrible clarity. He taunted the blind giant, mocking his brutish strength, boasting of the cleverness of Odysseus, son of Laertes, sacker of cities, who had blinded him. The name hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. On the beach, Polyphemus stopped his weeping. He stood to his full, terrifying height, his ruined face turning toward the sound. All joy bled from the ship. The men's laughter died, their hands freezing on the oars. They watched in silent dread as the giant staggered to the water's edge. Polyphemus lifted his massive arms toward the heavens. His voice, when it came, was no longer a roar of pain, but a low, resonant chant, a prayer woven from grief and fury. He called upon his father, Poseidon, the earth-shaker, lord of the seas. He recounted the wrong, the blinding, the theft, the name of the man who had done it. He did not ask for his own sight to be restored. He asked only for vengeance. Let this Odysseus, if he calls, himself a wanderer, never wander home. Let him lose all his companions, every last man. Let him find only trouble and strife waiting in his own hall. Let him return late, broken and alone, a stranger in his own house, and let his journey be long, bitter, and cursed by the god of the deep. The words settled over the ship like a physical weight. The air grew still and thick. The bright sun seemed to dim. The men felt the truth of the curse in their bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the sea spray. Their earlier joy turned to ash in their mouths. They looked at Odysseus, and for the first time saw not their cunning captain, but the architect of a divine wrath. He stood silent now, the taunt spent, staring at the giant's receding form. He had won his name's glory, and in doing so had traded their future for a moment of pride. To the west, where their home lay, the horizon began to bruise with purple-black clouds. The wind, once fair, shifted, carrying a new metallic scent. The first storm of Poseidon's wrath was gathering, a dark promise on the edge of the world, and they were sailing directly into its heart. Driven by the rising storm of Poseidon's anger, the single ship was hurled across the wine-dark sea for days, a leaf in a divine tantrum. When the winds finally relented, they revealed a wonder, a floating island ringed by a wall of unbroken bronze, its meadows eternally green. This was Aeolia, realm of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. The king, a gracious and curious host, welcomed the battered wanderers. For a full month, they rested in a peace that felt like a dream. They feasted at the royal table, their wounds, both of flesh and spirit, beginning to knit in the gentle air. Aeolus questioned Odysseus intently about Troy and the war, and Odysseus spoke of it all, though he omitted the curse of the Cyclops. On the day of their departure, Aeolus, moved by their plight, presented Odysseus with a gift beyond price. It was a leather bag, large and tightly stitched from the hide of a 9-year-old ox. Into this bag, with a mighty breath and a whispered command, Aeolus had bound all the contrary winds, the blustering north, the treacherous east, the sullen south. He left free only the gentle west wind, which he set to blow steadily from astern, a zephyr to guide them straight to Ithaca's shores. The bag was secured with a silver cord, gleaming in the dawn light. Aeolus warned that it must not be loosened until they stood upon their own soil. Odysseus accepted the gift with solemn gratitude, placing it in the hold of his ship, a secret hope nestled among the timbers. For 9 days and nights the west wind filled their sail with a constant, tender breath. The sea was a placid highway, the stars their faithful guides. On the 10th dawn, a cry went up from the lookout. There on the horizon lay the familiar, beloved shape of Ithaca, the dark bulk of Mount Neriton. The smoke from hearth fires a gray smudge against the sky. The men wept with joy, their oars forgotten. They were home. The long nightmare was over. Odysseus, who had not slept more than fitful hours since leaving Aeolia, felt the immense weight of vigilance finally slip from his shoulders. Exhaustion, deeper than any he had known, crashed over him. He left the steering oar to a trusted man, descended to the deck, and fell into a profound, dreamless sleep just as the sun cleared the hills of his homeland. But suspicion, that old shipmate, had boarded with them. The men, eyeing the fine leather bag in the hold, whispered. What treasure had their captain received from the Wind King? Gold, silver, jewels. Why should he keep such wealth secret while they returned with nothing but their lives? The sight of home, instead of calming their greed, inflamed it. They were moments from port. Surely they deserved a share. As Odysseus slept on, oblivious, one man crept forward and loosened the silver cord. The result was not a spill of treasure, but a cataclysm. The pent-up winds roared forth in a single, furious hurricane, a shrieking chaos of Boreas, Eurus, and Notus. The ship was snatched from the very gates of home and hurled back across the sea, a toy in a divine tantrum. Days later, battered and despairing, they found themselves once more before the bronze walls of Aeolia. Odysseus, his face etched with fresh anguish, begged the Wind King for help. But Aeolus stood on his rampart, his face cold. He pointed a stern finger at the broken bag, at the ship, at Odysseus himself. The message was clear. A man so hated by the gods that they would not let him keep a gift meant to guide him home was not a man to be aided. He was a man marked. Aeolus refused them shelter, refused even words, and ordered them gone from his island. The west wind, now silent, offered no second chance. They were cast adrift once more, not by storm, but by judgment, their glimpse of home now the cruelest memory of all. The sea, after their expulsion from Aeolia, felt like a prison without walls. They rode in a numb silence, the memory of Ithaca's shoreline a phantom pain behind their eyes. When land appeared again, it offered no comfort. It was a coast of sheer, iron-gray cliffs, broken only by a single, narrow inlet. The entrance was a mere slit in the rock, a throat of water leading to a hidden harbor within. The captains of the other ships, desperate for shelter and fresh water, urged entry. Odysseus, his instincts honed by betrayal and curse, held his own vessel back, ordering it to wait just outside the mouth, tethered to a rock at the cliff's base. He watched the 11 other ships glide single file into the shadowy passage, their sails furled, their oars dipping with a weary rhythm. From his vantage, Odysseus saw the harbor open into a perfect, still circle, surrounded on all sides by those impossible cliffs. It was a trap of stone. High above, on the rim of the cliffs, movement caught his eye. Figures stood there, massive even at that distance. They were not men. They were Laestrygonians. Their forms were like boulders given life, their limbs thick as tree trunks. They did not shout or gesture. They simply watched the ships enter their basin with a terrible, patient stillness. Then, with a coordinated silence more frightening than any war cry, they moved. They bent to the cliff edge and pried up slabs of rock, boulders that took 2 giants to lift. The first stone fell. It struck the lead ship amidships with a sound like a mountain cracking. The vessel disintegrated into splinters and screaming men. Then the air grew dark with falling stone. The giants hurled their missiles with appalling accuracy, each impact a thunderclap of destruction. Ships were crushed, driven under, smashed against the cliffs. The calm water churned into a froth of wreckage and blood. The giants then took up spears, long as ships' masts, and waded into the carnage. They speared the struggling men in the water as if they were fishing for panicked minnows, lifting them writhing on the points to be devoured raw. The screams were thin and distant from Odysseus's position, a chorus of agony muffled by stone and wind. He stood frozen at his own ship's prow, his knuckles white on the rail, witnessing the utter annihilation of his fleet, his comrades, in a matter of moments. It was not a battle, it was a harvest of meat. Terror, pure and cold, finally unlocked his limbs. He drew his sword not to fight, but to slash at the thick cable mooring his ship to the rock. "Row," he roared, his voice a ragged tear in his throat. "Row for your lives." His men, their faces masks of horror, threw themselves onto the oars. The single remaining ship shot backward from the cliff face, out into the open sea. They did not look back. They rowed with the strength of pure panic, driven by the echoes of splintering wood and the sight of giants stooping to their grisly feast. Behind them, the narrow harbor mouth vanished into the cliff line, a silent, stony mouth now filled with the bones of 11 ships and all the men who had sailed in them. Odysseus's command was reduced to a single vessel, its deck terribly quiet, its hull bearing the unbearable weight of being the only survivor. The single ship, a floating tomb of grief, crawled across a kinder sea. The surviving men were ghosts, their eyes hollow from witnessing the Laestrygonian slaughter. They moved by rope, their hands blistered on the oars, their spirits crushed under the cumulative weight of loss. When the low, wooded shore of Aea rose from the haze, they lacked even the energy for relief. They dragged the ship onto a sandy beach beneath fragrant pines and collapsed where they stood, falling into a sleep of the dead for 2 full days and nights. The island was unnervingly serene, alive with the chatter of birds and the hum of insects, a gentle world that felt like a mockery of their inner desolation. On the 3rd morning, a restless Odysseus left his snoring men and then became the perfect hostess. She led them all to baths of steaming water, anointing them with oils, dressing them in fine tunics and cloaks. In her great hall, a feast appeared, not through magic that felt sinister, but as the natural bounty of a goddess's home. The men ate and drank, their laughter returning, tentative at first, then booming. The year that followed was a surreal idyll, a season suspended outside of time. They lived in comfort, feasting on limitless food, resting on soft beds, their wounds of body and spirit slowly healing. Yet a moral ambiguity hung in the air, a sweet poison. This was not home, this was a beautiful detention. The men grew strong and lazy, their purpose softened by Circe's arts and attentions. Odysseus, though he shared the goddess's bed and learned much from her, felt the pull of Ithaca like a persistent, dull ache beneath the luxury. The respite was a deep, necessary breath, but it was breath held too long in a perfumed room, a prelude to the colder, harder air of the ordeal yet to come. The year on Aeaea unfolded like a strange, sweet dream, but even dreams must end. The seasons turned, and the men, their bodies restored and their bellies full, began to glance eastward with a restless longing. The memory of home, dulled by Circe's comforts, sharpened again into a persistent ache. They gathered around Odysseus on the shore where their lone ship was beached, their voices a low, urgent murmur. They spoke of Ithaca's rocky coasts, of aging parents, of wives and children who might have forgotten their faces. The enchantment of the island was wearing thin, its pleasures now feeling like a gilded chain. Odysseus felt the shift within himself. The solace he had found in Circe's arms and wisdom was real, but it was the solace of a harbor, not a homeland. He went to her in her sunlit courtyard. She saw the resolve in his eyes before he spoke. She did not plead or protest. Instead, her expression grew solemn, her divine beauty taking on a graver cast. She agreed they must depart, but her words carried a weight that stilled the air. Their journey, she said, could not yet turn toward the sunrise. There was a necessary detour, a path that led not across the sea, but down into the earth itself. Before he could find his way to the living, he must consult the dead. The ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias, she explained, alone held the knowledge of what awaited him in Ithaca and the true path to get there. Only his shade, nourished by blood, could unveil the future. A solemn dread settled over Odysseus as Circe began her instructions. Her voice was low and precise, a ritual chant. He must sail to the very edge of the world, to the mist-shrouded shore where the deep Oceanus encircles the lands of the living. There at the grove of Persephone he must dig a trench a cubit long and a cubit wide. He must pour libations to the dead, honey and milk, then wine, then clear water, and scatter white barley. He must promise the shades a barren heifer upon his safe return to Ithaca. Then he must sacrifice a black ram and a black ewe, turning their heads toward the realm of Erebus, while he himself looked back toward the river's current. The blood must flow into the trench, a dark summons. The ghosts would come, countless and famished, but he must hold them back with his drawn sword until Tiresias appeared to drink and speak. Circe warned of the pitiful shades, of his own mother who might appear, and commanded that no spirit be allowed to touch the blood before the prophet. Her instructions were a map of mourning, a sailor's chart for a voyage no living man should make. The mood in her hall shifted from the warmth of leave-taking to the chill of a funeral vigil. The crew, when they heard, fell into a terrified silence. The concept of sailing toward the house of Hades was a horror beyond monsters or storms. It was a journey into absolute negation. They prepared the ship with a somber, ritual care, loading the sacrificial animals and the vessels of libation. The usual banter of sailors was absent. Their movements were hushed, reverent. As they pushed the vessel from Circe's kindly shore, the sun seemed to lose its warmth. They set sail not for the familiar blue of the open sea, but toward the far west, where the sky perpetually melted into a bank of leaden mist. The water grew sluggish, the air cold and still. They were leaving the world of light and life behind, rowing slowly toward the sunless edge, where the boundaries between living and dead grew thin as a shadow. The realm of death awaited, and their prow cut the water like a blade opening a vein into the underworld. They sailed west into a perpetual twilight, where the sun was a memory and the sea grew thick and dark as pooled wine. The air turned cold and still, carrying a scent of damp earth and ancient stone. No birds followed their wake, no wind filled their sail. They rowed with a slow, fearful rhythm, the creak of oars the only sound in the immense silence. At last, they reached the shore of the world's end, a bleak, misty strand where the river Oceanus met the cypress groves of Persephone. The light was a gray, directionless gloom, and the very water seemed reluctant to lap the beach, sliding forward with a listless sigh. Following Circe's precise, somber instructions, Odysseus led his trembling men ashore. In a cleared space before a stand of bare, black trees, he dug a trench a cubit long and a cubit wide, the soil cold and heavy in his hands. Around it he poured the libations, first honey and milk, then dark wine, then clear water, each a plea to the powers below. He scattered white barley, promising the shades a barren heifer upon his safe return to Ithaca. His men held the sacrificial sheep, a black ram and a black ewe, their eyes rolling in animal terror. Odysseus slit their throats with his bronze blade, turning their heads toward the mist-shrouded inland while he faced the river. The blood, hot and dark, gushed into the trench, pooling in the raw earth with a coppery scent that seemed to vibrate in the still air. Then the dead came. They swarmed up from the mist like a sudden, silent tide, countless shades, translucent and sighing, their forms blurred at the edges. They stretched bony hands toward the trench, their eyes hollow pits of longing drawn by the vital scent of the blood. A murmur filled the air, a wordless ache of thirst. Odysseus stood firm, his heart hammering against his ribs. He drew his long sword and held it before the trench, a barrier of bright bronze. The ghosts flinched back, their desire warring with their fear of the keen metal that could still harm them in this liminal space. He held them at bay, his arm trembling not from effort but from the sheer, chilling weight of their presence. From the throng, one shade pushed forward, more distinct than the others. It was Elpenor, the youngest of his crew, his face pale with the shame of the living. He had not died in battle or storm, but in a drunken fall from Circe's roof. His neck snapped, his body left unburied. His ghost wept soundless tears, its form shimmering. It begged Odysseus, its voice a thin whisper like wind through reeds, to return to Aea and give his body proper rites, to burn it with his armor and raise a mound topped with his ore, so his spirit might find rest. The plea was a human anchor in the surreal horror, a reminder of a simple, earthly duty amidst the vastness of death. Odysseus, looking into the desperate eyes of his lost companion, swore an oath to the shade. Elpenor nodded, a flicker of peace crossing his translucent features before fading back into the murmuring crowd. The blood still steamed in the trench, and Odysseus tightened his grip on his sword, knowing the prophet's shade was yet to come, and that the true purpose of this dread journey still lay ahead in the whispering dark. From the murmuring host of shades, one figure advanced with a slow, certain step. He leaned upon a staff of gold, his eyes milky and unseeing, yet his presence carried an authority that stilled the other ghosts. It was Tiresias. The prophet's shade approached the trench, and Odysseus lowered his sword. The ancient seer bent, his form wavering like smoke, and drank deeply of the dark blood. As the vital fluid touched his lips, a shudder passed through him, and his voice emerged, not as a whisper, but clear and resonant, echoing in the sunless air. He spoke first of the immediate peril. The homeward path, he said, would lead them to Thrinacia, the sacred island of the sun god Helios, where his immortal cattle grazed. No matter the hunger, no matter the desperation, those beasts must not be harmed. To touch them was to invoke a doom that would swallow them all. The words were a cold command, settling on Odysseus's shoulders like a weight of ice. Then the prophet's sight turned to Ithaca. He described a house in turmoil, overrun with arrogant, wasteful men, suitors devouring his wealth, courting his wife, plotting the murder of his son. The image was vivid and sickening, his own hall echoing with alien laughter, his storerooms plundered, his loyal servants living in fear. The news was a blade twisted in a wound Odysseus had long imagined but never confirmed. Finally, Tiresias spoke of an end. After the suitors were dealt with, a task the prophet outlined with cryptic clarity. Odysseus must take an oar and journey inland, so far from the sea that men would mistake the oar for a winnowing fan. There, in a place utterly foreign to the salt and the waves, he must make sacrifice to Poseidon. Only then, with the earth-shaker's wrath appeased, would his own end come. A gentle death from the sea, arriving in ripe old age amidst a prosperous people. A peaceful death, far from the element that had defined and tormented his life. The prophecy hung in the misty air, a map of inevitable doom and a single, distant point of hope. The warning of the cattle was a sword over their heads, the news of the suitors a fire in his heart, the promise of a quiet death a paradox, a comfort so remote it felt like a cruelty. As Tiresias finished, his form began to dissipate, his knowledge spent. Odysseus stood alone by the dark trench, the blood now cold and congealing. The ghosts still murmured, but their sounds were distant. The prophet's words had framed the remainder of his life, casting a long, inescapable shadow over every league of sea yet to cross. The journey was no longer a simple struggle for survival. It was a fated path, its tragedies foretold, its final harbor known. He felt the weight of the future settle upon him, a burden heavier than any storm or monster, for it was the burden of knowing. With Tiresias's shade dissolved back into the gloom, Odysseus lowered his sword. He allowed the other ghosts to approach the trench, to drink the dark blood and briefly regain their voices. The parade of shadows began, each encounter a quiet knife to the heart. The first to step forward was a shade he knew instantly, though her form was dimmed by death. It was his mother, Anticle. She had been alive when he sailed for Troy. Now she stood before him, a silent question in her eyes. When she drank, her voice was a rustle of autumn leaves. She spoke not of illness or violence, but of a slow, internal wasting. She had died of grief, she said, her spirit frayed and finally severed by the endless absence of her son, by the rumors of his loss. The news struck Odysseus with a physical force. His pride, his cunning, his very survival had been the instrument of her death. He reached for her, but his arms passed through her like mist, a futile embrace that underscored the absolute gulf between them. Next came Agamemnon, the great king of men. His shade was majestic yet bitter, the wounds of his murderous homecoming still visible upon him. He drank, and his voice was a low growl of warning. He spoke of his own wife, Clytemnestra, and her treachery, of the bath and the net and the axe. His tale was a dark mirror held up to Odysseus's own return. "Trust no woman," the shade of the Atreid whispered, his eyes burning with posthumous rage. "Not even your own. Let your approach be secret, your testing absolute." His words planted a seed of cold suspicion, a poison that would linger long after this shore was left behind, coloring Odysseus's thoughts of the faithful Penelope with an unwelcome shade of doubt. Then came Achilles, striding forth with the same swift grace he possessed in life, a ghost of perfect martial beauty. He drank and asked for news of his son Neoptolemus. When Odysseus praised the young man's bravery at Troy, a flicker of something like pride crossed the shade's face, but it was swiftly drowned in a profound, aching melancholy. "Do not glorify death to me, Odysseus," Achilles said, his voice hollow. "I would rather be a hired servant, a slave to the poorest landless peasant on earth, than be king over all the lifeless dead." The declaration hung in the air, a stunning renunciation of the heroic code for which he had sacrificed everything. The glory he had chosen was ash in his mouth. For Odysseus, who still clung to the hope of glory in his homecoming, the words were a chilling correction. The greatest of the Greeks found the afterlife a vacant, joyless dominion, where fame was meaningless and sensation was a memory. It was a reflection on loss that questioned the very value of the struggles that defined them. Other heroes appeared: Ajax, still silent and smoldering over the loss of Achilles' armor, turned away without drinking, a monument to enduring wrath. He saw Minos judging the dead, and Orion forever hunting ghostly beasts. Each figure was a lesson in eternity, a snapshot of an existence stripped of warmth, purpose, and consequence. These encounters were not loud or violent, but deeply reflective, dialogues of silence and sorrow that dissected the concepts of home, glory, and legacy. As the last shades faded, drawn back into the misty depths, Odysseus stood exhausted on the bleak shore. The blood in the trench was gone, absorbed by the thirsty earth. He felt older, burdened by truths more crushing than any physical trial. He had looked into the face of death and found it not monstrous, but mournful, a realm where love was a memory, victory was empty, and the only true prize was the fragile, beating heart of a living man, still yearning for home. The return to Circe's sunlit isle was a journey from a land of ghosts to a world of solid, fragrant reality. The crew, hollow-eyed from the underworld's chill, fell upon the shore with desperate gratitude. Their first act under Odysseus's grim direction was to fulfill his oath. They found Elpenor's body where it had fallen, a sad, crumpled heap at the base of Circe's palace. They carried him to a cleared space, built a pyre of sweet-smelling cedar and pine, and placed his armor upon it. As the flames consumed their comrade, they raised a mound of earth and planted his polished oar atop it, a marker for a sailor who would sail no more. The ritual was simple, solemn, and human, a necessary stitching of the mortal world after the unraveling they had witnessed. Circe welcomed them, her gaze knowing. That evening, as they feasted, she drew Odysseus aside. Her warnings were precise, a navigational chart for horrors yet to come. "First," she said, they would encounter the sirens. Their island was a meadow strewn with the bones of men who had listened. Their song was not mere melody, but a distillation of all knowledge, past, present, and future, sung with such unbearable beauty that any who heard it would forget home, family, and life itself, lured to a wasting death upon the shore. There was only one defense. The crew must plug their ears with softened beeswax until they heard nothing but the drum of their own blood. Odysseus, if he wished to hear the song and survive, must be bound to the mast with unyielding ropes. No pleas, no commands from him should be heeded until the island was far behind. The next morning, as the ship departed Aea for the final time, the men worked with nervous haste. They kneaded the wax until it was pliable, then pressed it deep into their ears, sealing themselves in a silent world. For Odysseus, they used the very ropes that had moored the ship, winding them around his chest and arms, knotting them fast to the sturdy mast. He stood, a willing prisoner, as the coastline faded. Soon, a dead calm fell upon the sea. The air grew thick and sweet. Then on the breeze came the first notes. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. It was the answer to every question he had ever asked, the true name of the wind, the secret paths of the stars, the fate of every comrade lost, the exact color of Penelope's eyes in the firelight of their bridal chamber. It promised not just knowledge, but a perfect, empathetic understanding of all things, a unity with the cosmos that would dissolve the lonely, striving self. The beauty of it was terrible, an ache of sublime perfection. It called him home, but to a home greater than Ithaca, a final, welcoming oblivion where all struggles ceased. Agony tore through him. The song was a physical pull, a hook in his heart. He strained against the ropes, his muscles corded, his eyes wild. He shouted, begged, ordered his men to turn the ship, to free him, to steer toward that blissful shore. He promised them kingdoms, treasures, immortal fame. But the crew, deaf and pale, saw only their captain's frantic, wordless contortions. They saw the veins standing out on his neck, the desperate pleading in his eyes, and they rowed harder, their gazes fixed on the horizon, trusting Circe's warning over their leader's apparent madness. They bound him tighter as he struggled, adding more ropes until he could barely breathe. The sirens' song swelled, now a heartbreaking lament for all he was. Abandoning a personal serenade of loss, tears streamed down his face. He wanted to die if he could not reach it. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the song faded, thinning into the empty sea hush. The island slipped astern, a green speck amidst white bones. The men unstopped their ears. They untied their captain, who slumped against the mast, hollowed out, bearing the memory of a happiness so profound it was indistinguishable from despair. He had survived by being bound, but a part of him had been forever lured onto that meadow, leaving a ghost of himself among the bleached ruins. The silence after the sirens was a ringing void, filled only by the ragged sound of their own breathing. Odysseus, untied from the mast, felt scraped hollow, the ghost of that perfect song still echoing in his bones. But the sea offered no respite. Ahead the strait revealed itself, a nightmare of geography made manifest. To starboard rose a sheer, smooth cliff, its summit lost in swirling mist, an impassable wall of stone. At its base, barely a bowshot from their course, lay the horror of Charybdis. It was not a whirlpool as sailors understand it, but a living mouth in the sea. 3 times a day, the water within that yawning cavern would drain with a deafening, gulping roar, sucking down everything within its reach: fish, driftwood, entire ships, into a black, frothing throat. Then, after a terrible pause, it would disgorge it all again in a geyser of spray and wreckage, the water boiling with a fury that churned the sea white for a league around. The sound was a continuous, low thunder, a promise of total annihilation. To port lay the other horror, the cliff of Scylla. It was lower but shrouded in a permanent, oily mist. From within that gloom they could hear a high, canine yammering, the sound of 6 frantic, eternal hungers. Circe's words were a cold map in Odysseus's mind. Scylla was a 6-headed monster, each head on a long, serpentine neck, who would snatch men from the deck. The choice was no choice at all, a calculated sacrifice versus utter destruction. He could not risk Charybdis. Its maw would swallow the ship whole. They must sail closer to Scylla's cliff, accepting the inevitable loss. He did not tell his men. Their spirits were already frayed beyond endurance by the underworld and the sirens' haunting. To speak of the 6-headed horror now would be to invite a panic that would doom them all to the whirlpool. Instead, he moved among them with a forced calm, his voice steady. He spoke only of the whirlpool, ordering them to pull with all their strength to keep clear of its pull. He himself put on his finest bronze armor, the greaves and breastplate gleaming dully in the strange, mist-diffused light. It was a futile gesture against Scylla's darting heads, but it was a hero's ritual, a preparation for a battle he knew he could not fight, a way to cling to some semblance of control. The men, seeing their captain armed, took a grim heart. They bent to their oars, their eyes wide with terror as they stared at the churning chaos of Charybdis. The ship was drawn toward the strait's narrow throat, the current quickening. The roar of the whirlpool filled the world, a bass note of doom. The yammering from the misty cliff grew sharper, more eager. Odysseus stood in the prow, armored and helpless, his gaze fixed on the swirling mist where the monster waited, his heart a cold, heavy stone. He had chosen the path of the lesser horror, and now he must steer his ship and his doomed men directly into its shadow, praying only that the sacrifice would be swift, and that the whirlpool's hunger would remain unsated. The ship entered the strait's narrow throat, a chip of wood between 2 ravening gods. The roar of Charybdis was a physical pressure, a deafening suck and boom that vibrated in their teeth. The men rowed with a frantic, silent desperation, their muscles cracking as they fought the current pulling them toward the whirlpool's foaming lip. Their eyes were fixed on that churning abyss, seeing nothing else. Odysseus stood armored in the prow, but his gaze was locked on the mist-shrouded cliff to port. The yammering ceased. An awful, poised silence fell from that direction. Then from the oily gloom, 6 necks uncoiled like lightning. They were not serpentine, but monstrous canine things, each ending in a head with triple rows of needle teeth. They struck with a speed that defied the eye. 6 arcs of scaled flesh shot over the gunwales. 6 sets of jaws snapped shut. 6 of his best men, men who had rowed from Troy, who had survived the Cyclops and the dead, were plucked from the deck. For a heartbeat they hung in the air, their faces contorted not with fear but with a profound, betrayed astonishment. They screamed a single name, not in prayer but in accusation. Odysseus! The sound was torn away by the wind. Then they were gone, reeled back into the mist. From the cliff came the wet, crunching sounds of consumption, the brief, choked-off cries utterly silenced. Odysseus watched, his hand white on his sword hilt, the bronze armor suddenly a ridiculous hollow shell. He saw nothing but the mist. He heard only the feeding. He had chosen this. Circe's cold calculus had been correct. Lose 6 or lose all. The knowledge was an acid in his soul. This was not battle, it was a transaction, a brutal tithe paid to the geography of nightmare. The ship, lightened by its terrible toll, surged forward past the cliff, out of the mist's reach. Charybdis to starboard gave a final, bellowing roar as if cheated of a greater feast. They were through. The open sea lay ahead, calm and sun-drenched, a cruel mockery. The remaining men collapsed over their oars, sobbing with relief and horror. They had survived. Odysseus remained standing, staring back at the receding strait. The gilt was a colder, heavier armor than any bronze. He had not fought. He had not warned. He had presided, their screams his. Name on their lips would echo in the hollow of his chest forever. The true cost of command, the brutal arithmetic of survival that left the soul shipwrecked. The greater part of the crew lived, but the victory was ashes. They rowed on, bearing the silent, screaming weight of the 6 who had paid their passage. The memory of Scylla's feast was a fresh wound, the screams of the 6 men still echoing in the hollows of their ship. The survivors rowed with a mechanical numbness, their eyes vacant, their spirits scraped raw. When the island of Thrinacia rose from the sea, a verdant, low-lying land of rich meadows and gentle streams, it offered no solace, only a new arena for dread. Odysseus felt the weight of Tiresias's prophecy settle upon him like a leaden cloak. He knew this place. He knew the immortal, sleek-coated cattle of the sun god Helios that grazed there, tended by his divine daughters. The prophet's warning was a cold, clear command in his mind. Touch those beasts and doom follows. He gathered his haggard crew and spoke with a fierce, desperate urgency. He described the curse, the certain wrath of a Titan god, the utter annihilation that would follow any sacrilege. They must not land. They must sail on, no matter their hunger. But the men's eyes were not on him. They were fixed on the green shore. Their bellies, empty for days, cramped at the sight of such plenty. Their minds, shattered by Scylla's horror, could not hold the abstract threat of a future doom. They needed solid earth underfoot, food in their guts, a respite from the sea's relentless torment. Eurylochus, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and bitterness, spoke for them all. He argued that to sail on in their weakened state was itself a death sentence. Better to risk the gods' anger tomorrow than the sea's mercy tonight. The men murmured their agreement, a mutiny born of despair. Odysseus, outnumbered and seeing the wild, hungry light in their eyes, relented with a heart full of foreboding. They beached the ship on a sandy cove, but he made them swear a mighty oath by all they held sacred that they would hunt only the wild goats they saw in the hills, and leave the splendid cattle untouched. The oath was given, but the words felt brittle in the air. For a month, contrary winds blew from the east, trapping them on the island. They ate the goats and the fish they caught, but their stores dwindled. Hunger, a more immediate god, began to gnaw at their resolve. The sight of the sun god's cattle became a constant temptation. The beasts were magnificent. their hides gleaming like polished metal in the sunlight, their movements serene and fat with divine grace. One evening, while Odysseus had withdrawn to a lonely part of the shore to pray to the gods for a change in the wind, Eurylochus gathered the men. His words were quiet, persuasive, weaving a fatal logic. They were starving. The master was gone. The gods had already forsaken them. Perhaps if they made a grand sacrifice too. The gods with the finest of the cattle, appeasing them with the savory smoke, they might be forgiven and granted passage home. It was a lie, but it was a lie they desperately needed. The men, their reason clouded by hunger and hopelessness, agreed. The slaughter was performed not with the rapacity of pirates, but with a haunting, solemn dread. They chose the finest bull, its coat like sunlight on water. They surrounded it, their hands trembling. When the blade fell, the beast lowed not in pain, but with a deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the very air. They skinned and butchered it with ritual care, wrapping the choice thighs in fat to offer to the gods. But no fire would catch under the meat. The wood hissed and sputtered, the flesh roasting with a sickly, wrong scent. The hides upon the ground began to crawl, and the meat upon the spits bellowed as if still alive. The men ate anyway, their faces pale with terror, the taste of sacrilege like ashes in their mouths, fulfilling the prophecy with every silent, guilty bite. The sacrilege hung in the air, a stench of burnt fat and dread that no sea breeze could dispel. For 6 days the men waited in a paralysis of terror, their bellies heavy with the cursed meat, their eyes scanning the serene sky for a sign. The 7th dawn broke not with light, but with a stillness so profound it felt like the world holding its breath. Then, as the last of the butchered bones were cast into the sea, the wind shifted. A gentle, steady westerly filled the sail, the very wind they had prayed for. A fragile, desperate hope flickered among the crew. Perhaps the gods had relented. Perhaps the sacrifice, however profane, had been accepted. They scrambled aboard, their movements frantic with the need to be gone. Odysseus, his heart a cold stone, gave the order. The ship slid from the beach, cutting a clean wake into the open sea. For a few blessed hours, the island of Thrinacia dwindled astern, the sun warm on their backs. They dared to believe they had escaped. Then the horizon to the east darkened, not with clouds, but with a gathering, unnatural shadow. The air grew thick and metallic. High above, unseen in the glare, the sun god Helios stood in the halls of Olympus, his divine radiance dimmed by fury. He laid his charge before Zeus, king of gods, his words a searing indictment of the oath breakers. Justice was demanded, and the father of gods nodded his terrible assent. The strike was not a bolt from a clear sky, but the sky itself becoming the bolt. A soundless violet flash consumed the world, followed by a crack of thunder that was not sound but pure force. The ship did not shatter, it vaporized. One moment a vessel of wood and men and hope existed. The next, there was only a column of steam and a rain of charred splinters falling onto suddenly boiling water. The crew were gone, not drowned, but unmade, their atoms scattered into the seething foam. No cry escaped them. Their end was absolute, a divine punctuation to the prophecy. Odysseus alone survived. The blast threw him clear, the heat singeing his skin, the concussion driving the breath from his lungs. He found himself in the water amidst the wreckage, his ears ringing in the sudden awful silence. His hands, acting on instinct, closed around a floating spar, the mast and a fragment of the keel still bound by sodden rigging. He hauled his body onto this pitiful raft, clinging to it as the sea, now churned by the aftermath of divine wrath, began to heave. He looked back. Thrinacia was a green smudge on the horizon. Ahead, he realized with a fresh wave of despair, the currents were pulling him inexorably eastward, back the way they had come, back toward the roaring throat of Charybdis and the yammering cliff of Scylla. For 9 days and nights he clung to the splintered wood, a speck on the vast, indifferent ocean. He passed through the strait a second time, a lone witness to his own past horrors. He saw Charybdis in her draining cycle, the whirlpool's maw opening like the pit of Tartarus, and he paddled with frantic, bleeding hands to skirt its edge. He saw Scylla's cliff shrouded in its perpetual mist, and heard the faint, hungry yelping, but the monster did not stir for so meager a scrap. He was a ghost already, drifting through the geography of his own doom. The sun rose and set, a mocking, golden eye. He had no food, no water save the rain he caught in his mouth during brief, squalling showers. His skin cracked and blistered. His mind frayed into a haze of thirst and memory. On the 10th dawn, the sea gentled. A line of palm trees broke the horizon. The current carried his makeshift raft through a gap in a fringing reef and deposited it, with a soft sigh, onto a beach of white sand. The island was Odyssey. He lacked the strength to stand. He crawled from the water, his body leaving a furrow in the sand, and collapsed at the tree line, his fingers digging into the cool, solid earth. The journey was over. The curse of Poseidon was fulfilled. He was the last man alone, all companions lost, washed ashore on an unknown world, his home farther away than it had ever been. The waves lapped gently at his feet, as if apologizing for their violence before receding into the vast blue silence. He did not find the island found him, a raft of flesh and splintered memory washed onto its shores. Odyssey was a dream of green, a place where time itself seemed to grow moss on its stones. Waterfalls sang into clear pools. Cedars sighed in a perpetual, gentle breeze. The air was soft with the scent of blooming iris and cypress. It was a paradise crafted by a divine hand, and its architect was Calypso, the nymph with the braided hair. She found him at the water's edge, more corpse than man, and her heart, a deep well of loneliness, was stirred. With immortal hands she carried him to her cavern, a vault of living rock hung with vines, where a fire of fragrant cedar burned without. A smoke. For 7 years he was her guest and her captive. She offered him everything the mortal world could not, ambrosia and nectar that banished age and fatigue, a bed softer than cloud, and her own immortal self as his lover. She sang to him in a voice that made the stars seem to pulse in sympathy, weaving tales of eternity. Her cave was a sanctuary from storm, from monster, from loss. Here, there was no Poseidon's wrath, no screaming straits, no hungry ghosts. There was only the murmur of the spring at the cavern's heart, and the slow, sweet turn of days that bled into one another without seam or memory. Yet this beautiful imprisonment was a trial of the soul more subtle than any faced before. The Lotus Eaters offered forgetfulness. Calypso offered perfection. Each morning, he would walk to the headland and stare across the endless, empty sea, his eyes scouring the horizon for a break in the blue monotony that never came. He would sit on the same smooth rock, the salt spray, drying on skin that no longer aged, and feel a melancholy so deep it had no bottom. The offer was clear: eternal youth, peace, and a goddess's devotion in exchange for his identity. To stay was to become a beautiful fixture in her grotto, a cherished statue of a hero, his stories calcifying into legend while the man within slowly dissolved. At night by her fire he would see Ithaca in the flames, not the grand palace but the small, mortal details. The gnarled olive tree in the courtyard, the particular wear on a threshold stone, the sound of a specific dog's bark. These memories were the anchors of his self, and they grew heavier, not lighter, with each passing year of comfort. Calypso's love was real, but it was the love of a collector for a rare specimen. She wanted to preserve him, to keep him as he was, which meant freezing him forever in a state of longing. He was both cherished and erased. The cavern, for all its beauty, was a gilded cage where the bars were made of soft words and softer twilight, and the lock was his own weary heart's temptation to finally, mercifully, stop yearning. He tended a small, secret fire of his own, the memory of home, and fed it daily with his vigil on the headland, a silent rebellion against the paradise that sought to gentle him into oblivion. On Olympus, where the air is clarity itself, the goddess Athena stood before the throne of her father. She spoke not of thunder or war, but of a man worn thin by longing, trapped in a gilded stillness on a forgotten shore. She spoke of Ithaca's unraveling, of a son grown to manhood under a cloud of doubt, of a wife's fidelity stretched over 20 years like a single, fraying thread. Justice, she argued, had been served 100 times over. The sea's debt was paid in full. Zeus, whose will moves the scales of fate, listened. His brow, where storms are born, remained untroubled. He nodded. The order was given. Hermes, the messenger, fastened his golden sandals and took wing. He flew across the wine-dark sea, past the known world to Ogyges' emerald heart. He found Calypso at her loom, the shuttle clicking a rhythm of centuries. The scent of cedar and burning time hung in the air. He delivered the command of the cloud-gatherer, crisp and unadorned: release the man. Let him build a raft and go. Calypso's beautiful face darkened like a shore before a squall. Anger, sharp and ancient, flashed in her eyes. She railed against the injustice of the gods, who took mortal lovers freely yet begrudged a nymph her companionship. But her defiance was a wave breaking against a cliff. She bowed her head, the gesture one of obedience, not acceptance. She found Odysseus on his headland rock, his gaze as ever fixed on the empty horizon. Her voice, when she spoke, had lost its customary music, replaced by a strained resignation. She told him of the gods' decree. A wild, painful hope flared in his chest, so sudden it felt like a new wound. She would help him, she said, her words practical, her eyes avoiding his. Together they felled tall trees, alder, poplar, and fir. With her divine guidance, he drilled, joined, and pegged, crafting a broad, flat raft. She wove him a sail of sturdy cloth and gave him stores: skins of dark wine and water, a sack of grain, dried meat, and other preserved bounty from her isle. The work took days, performed in a silence thick with unspoken words. On the final morning, as he prepared to launch the clumsy vessel into the surf, she approached him one last time. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, immortal sorrow. She offered it again, her voice barely a whisper, "Stay. Remain with her, and she would make him immortal, untouched by age or death, to share her timeless days forever." The temptation was a physical pull, a warm, sleepy current promising an end to all struggle. He looked at her, at the paradise she embodied, and then past her to the vast, perilous sea. His choice was not a rejection of her, but an affirmation of his own flawed, mortal essence, of Penelope's aging hands, of Telemachus's unknown face, of the smell of his own soil. He chose the certainty of death and the distant chance of home over a flawless, endless now. He pushed the raft into the breaking waves and hauled himself aboard. Calypso stood on the white sand, a diminishing figure of perfect, lonely grace, as the wind caught his makeshift sail. For 17 days and nights, he sailed eastward, guided by the stars she had taught him to read, the raft riding the swell with a fragile dignity. On the 18th day, just as the faintest scent of distant land teased the air, the horizon to the north curdled into a line of purple-black. Poseidon, returning from a feast among the Ethiopians, saw the tiny craft from his chariot far above. A cold fury settled in the god's breast. The man was free and moving. The earth-shaker raised his trident and stirred the sea to its foundations. The friendly wind died. The sky ripped open. A storm, born of pure divine wrath, fell upon the raft, its timbers groaning like a living thing in agony. Poseidon's storm was not an event in the world. It became the world. The sea ceased to be water and became a range of liquid mountains, each peak collapsing into a valley of frothing chaos. The raft, a proud construct of Calypso's guidance, was dismantled with contemptuous ease. The ropes screamed and parted. The pegged joints exploded into splinters. Odysseus was not thrown from the wreckage so much as the world of wood fell away from him, leaving him alone in the roaring, green-black void. For 2 days and 2 nights he was a plaything for the god's fury. He swallowed salt water until it burned in his lungs. He was driven deep into cold, silent troughs where the light faded to a murky green, then hurled skyward on collapsing crests, gasping at air torn to spray. His mind narrowed to a single, brute imperative: reach the next breath. The sea was a millstone grinding away all thought of past or future, of Ithaca or Calypso, leaving only the animal present of struggle. His limbs moved with a blind, rhythmic thrashing, fighting not for progress, but simply to keep his head above the consuming tide. On the 3rd morning, the storm's heart passed, leaving behind a heaving, gray waste. Exhaustion was a weight pulling him down into the quiet depths. As his strength finally ebbed, a figure appeared on the swell beside him, a woman formed of sea foam and light. It was Leucothea, the sea goddess once mortal. In her hand she held a gossamer veil, woven from the essence of the sea itself. Her voice was the sound of a calm shore. She told him to shed his heavy, sodden clothes, to tie her veil around his chest, and to swim. The land of the Phaeacians was near. When he reached its safety, he must cast the veil back into the sea without looking. He obeyed, his fingers fumbling with the sodden tunic. The moment the divine fabric touched his skin, a new strength, cool and fluid, seeped into his muscles. It did not banish his fatigue, but transmuted it, turning his desperate thrashing into something resembling purposeful motion. He swam. The sea was no longer an enemy but a medium, its resistance a familiar challenge. Hours passed, the sun a blurred coin behind scudding clouds. Then, a darker line solidified on the horizon, not the vague promise of cloud but the solid truth of land. Scheria. The sight was a pain more acute than any cramp. He swam until his feet scraped rock, then sand. He dragged himself from the surf onto a river's mouth where the fresh water met the salt. The sweet current was a blessing. He drank until his stomach ached, then crawled further up the bank beyond the tide's reach. There, under the shelter of a thick, double-grown olive bush, his body simply stopped. The divine veil slipped from his chest, a wisp of mist returning to the air. Consciousness did not fade, it shattered. He collapsed into the soft, leaf-strewn earth and asleep. Deeper than any enchantment, heavier than any stone, swallowed him whole. He lay like the dead, but for the faint, stubborn rise and fall of his chest, a man reduced to his most essential function, to endure and to rest. He awoke to laughter. It was a sound so alien, so purely human and joyous, that for a moment he believed himself still dreaming in the underworld's gloom. The laughter was bright and clear, punctuated by the rhythmic thump of a ball and the gentle splash of water. Odysseus stirred beneath his olive bush, every muscle shrieking in protest. He was naked, his skin crusted with salt and patterned with livid bruises from the sea's beating. His hair was matted with seaweed. His body was a map of old scars and fresh abrasions. He peered through the tangled branches. Down by the river's edge, where the water widened into a clear pool, a group of young women played. They were handmaidens, their gowns of fine linen hitched up as they tossed a ball of woven crimson. Among them, one shone with a different light. She moved with a natural grace, her laughter ringing sweeter than the others. Her hair was the color of sunlight on ripe wheat, and her bearing, even in play, spoke of innate nobility. This was Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous. They had brought the palace laundry to beat and rinse in the fresh flow, and the finished robes lay spread on the sun-warmed stones like fields of bright flowers. Odysseus knew his appearance was monstrous. To emerge naked, salt ghastly, from the bushes would terrify them, likely sending them fleeing to the city. He had no weapon, no gift, no strength for force. His only tools were his wits and his words. Breaking a leafy branch from the olive tree to hold before him, a token of peace and supplication, he stepped from his hiding place. The laughter died instantly. The handmaidens shrieked, scattering like startled birds, their laundry forgotten. Only Nausicaa stood her ground, her eyes wide but unflinching, held by it. Courage Athena had placed in her heart. Odysseus did not approach. He stopped at a respectful distance, the branch held carefully. Then he began to speak. His voice, long unused for anything but commands and curses, emerged rough but carefully modulated. He praised her beauty, comparing her to a young palm tree he had once seen on Delos. He acknowledged his own frightful state, a castaway who had suffered much. He appealed not to her pity, but to her reverence for the gods, for Zeus himself watches over strangers and suppliants. He spoke of his longing for home, his wife, his distant people. His words were not a plea, but an eloquent testament to shared humanity, weaving humility with respect, acknowledging her power in this moment with a courtier's grace. He asked only for a scrap of cloth to cover himself and directions to the town. Nausicaa listened, her initial fear melting into awe. Here was no savage, but a man of clear mind and noble speech, a storm-tossed king washed up on her shore. The civility of his address was a balm after the tales of monsters. She called her trembling maids back, chiding their fear. She ordered them to bring a tunic and a cloak from the laundry, and a flask of oil for him to cleanse himself. She gave him directions to her father's palace, advising him to follow her cart at a distance through the fields to avoid gossip, and to seek her mother, Queen Arete, upon arrival. Her kindness was practical, swift, and profound. Odysseus took the clothing and the oil. He washed the salt from his skin in the river, the fresh water feeling like a rebirth. He anointed himself, and the fine Phaeacian fabric felt alien and miraculous against his scarred flesh. As Nausicaa and her maids departed with their cart, he waited, then followed, a solitary figure moving through the lush, ordered farmland. The sun was warm, the air sweet with the scent of ripening fruit. It was a moment of staggering simplicity, an act of human decency, offered without expectation. After the Cyclops' cave, Circe's spells, and the screaming straits, this quiet charity from a young princess was the most wondrous thing he had encountered. It was the world as it should be, a glimpse of the hearth and community he had fought for 20 years to regain, and it filled him with a hope more potent than any god's aid. Following the princess's discreet directions, Odysseus approached the city of the Phaeacians. The walls were high and strong, but the gates stood open, welcoming the evening. Within, the ordered streets and prosperous homes spoke of a people blessed by the gods, untouched by the wars and wanderings that had defined his life. The palace of King Alcinous rose before him, magnificent beyond any he had seen since Troy. Its walls were of burnished bronze, the doors were gold, and silver dogs crafted by Hephaestus himself stood guard on either side, immortal and watchful. The air shimmered with the scent of cedar and citrus from the lush gardens. Within the courtyard, he passed through the outer court and into the great hall, his heart a drum beneath the fine tunic Nausicaa had given him. The room was vast, lit by braziers that cast a warm, dancing light on tapestries depicting gods and heroes. At the far end, on a polished dais, sat King Alcinous and Queen Arete. The king had a beard like sea foam and eyes of calm authority. The queen, weaving with a golden shuttle, possessed a grave, observant stillness that commanded its own respect. Following the deepest custom, Odysseus went directly to the hearth, the sacred center of the house. He knelt before Queen Arete, the true power in the realm, and clasped her knees in the gesture of a suppliant. He touched his lips to her hand, then sat in the ashes of the hearth itself, a symbol of utter humility and need. A silence fell over the hall, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The Phaeacian nobles who had been feasting stared at this sudden, noble-looking beggar in their midst. Alcinous, after a moment's astonishment, raised him up and seated him in a place of honor, ordering food and wine to be brought. They feasted, and the rich, savory meat and dark wine were a profound comfort to Odysseus's starved senses. When the meal was done, the blind bard Demodocus was led in. His lyre was placed in his hands, and at the muse's prompting he began to sing. He did not choose a tale of distant myth, but of the very war that had defined Odysseus's life. He sang of the quarrel between Achilles and Odysseus, of the bitter strife that had festered in the Greek camp before Troy's walls. The words, woven with divine skill, were not mere story. They were a key that unlocked a sealed chamber of memory. Odysseus heard the names of the dead, the strategies, the old, foolish angers. He saw the faces of men long gone, felt the weight of his own choices. A great wave of grief, held back for years by survival's sheer necessity, broke over him. He pulled his borrowed purple cloak over his head to hide his face, but his shoulders shook with silent, wrenching sobs. The tears, hot and shameful, fell into his cup of wine. Only Alcinous, seated beside him, noticed the hero's distress beneath the fabric. The king let the song finish. Then in the quiet that followed, he spoke. He asked the stranger gently but directly to reveal his name, his land, and the story of his sorrows. The time for hiding was over. Odysseus lowered the cloak, his face ravaged by memory. He wiped his eyes with a trembling hand, looked at the expectant, kind faces of the Phaeacians, and drew a breath that seemed to draw up 20 years of dust and salt. "I am Odysseus," he said, his voice rough but clear in the hushed hall, "son of Laertes, known to men for every kind of craft, and my fame reaches heaven. I am he who makes his home in Ithaca, that bright land seen against the sky." The name, spoken aloud after so long in shadows, hung in the fragrant air, a confession and a beginning. The name, once released, seemed to echo in the fragrant stillness of the hall. The Phaeacian nobles leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the firelight and rapt attention. King Alcinous nodded, his expression one of grave encouragement. Queen Arete's hands lay still upon her loom. Odysseus felt the weight of their expectation, a different burden than the seas or a monster's. This was the weight of memory, of shaping chaos into narrative. He drew a slow breath, the scent of roasted meat and wine now mingling with the ghost smells of salt, smoke, and terror. He would begin at the beginning, not of the war, but of the journey home, the true war. He spoke of the fall of Troy, not with a hero's boast, but with a weary man's hindsight. The fires on the beach, the savage joy, the urgent pull westward, all were recounted with a flat, drained cadence that hinted at the ignorance of those departing moments. They had thought the trials were behind them. He described the sack of Ismarus, the Sicyon city, and his voice held a new layer of regret. The plunder, the feasting, the arrogant delay, he painted it not as a thrilling raid, but as a fatal failure of command, a collective madness born of a war mind they could not shed. The dawn counterattack was described with stark economy. The blood on the sand, the 6 men from each ship lost, the desperate flight. It was the first lesson, he implied, and they had failed it utterly, paying in lives for a lesson they would need to learn again and again. Then he told of the gray sea's loneliness, the days of empty sailing that gnawed at the spirit more effectively than any enemy. His description was not of epic struggle, but of a slow erosion, the dissolution of identity into monotony. This, he seemed to say, was the true enemy they were least equipped to face, the vast, patient indifference of the world. From that emptiness they had stumbled into the false solace of the Lotus Eaters. Here, his voice grew somber, introspective. He lingered on the eerie peace, the sweet, heavy perfume, the gentle people offering oblivion in a pale fruit. The horror, as he recounted it now, was not in the transformation of his men, but in their willing surrender. The struggle to drag them back to the ships was a physical battle against a spiritual poison, and his victory felt Pyrrhic. He had saved their bodies, but a part of their will had remained on that shore, and he had known it even then. Finally, he came to the Cyclops. The tale was famous, but his telling was stripped of cunning's glamour. He described the Goat Island's bounty and his own fatal curiosity not as heroic daring, but as a proud man's folly. He painted the cave in vivid, dreadful detail, the vast scale, the scent of cheese and dung, the sealing thud of the stone. The deaths of his men were not heroic sacrifices, but brutal, senseless consumption. The planning of the stake, the offering of the wine, the lie of nobody, these were acts of desperate survival, not clever triumphs. And when he spoke of his final, prideful taunt, revealing his true name to the blinded Polyphemus, a profound silence gripped the hall. He did not justify it. He let the act hang there, followed by the giant's prayer to Poseidon, word for terrible word. The curse was not just a plot point. It was the hinge upon which every subsequent disaster turned, and he narrated it as the moment he himself had authored their doom. His voice did not break, but it grew thinner, weathered by the admission. He was not just recounting adventures. He was performing an autopsy on his own pride, and the first part of the tale concluded in the gathering storm of a god's wrath, a tempest he had called down upon his own head. From the storm of the curse, his tale flowed into the deceptive calm of Aeolus's isle. He described the month of rest, the Wind King's kindness, and the leather bag, a gift that felt, for a time, like divine pardon. The 9-day voyage home, the sight of Ithaca's fires and his own exhausted sleep were recounted with a haunting tenderness, the memory of that lost moment sharper than any wound. Then, the fatal suspicion of his men, the loosened cord, and the hurricane of unleashed winds. His voice grew flat, drained of emotion, as he described their return to Aeolia and the king's cold, final refusal. It was not anger he conveyed, but a profound lesson in celestial justice. The gods help those not hated by the gods. The horror of the Laestrygonians followed, a swift and brutal culling. His narration was stark, visual, the narrow harbor, the silent giants on the cliffs, the rain of boulders, the spearing of men like fish. He lingered on the perspective from his single ship outside the cleft, the helpless witness to the annihilation of 11 vessels and all the lives within them. The survivor's guilt was a palpable presence in his words, a silent scream beneath the description of cutting the cable and fleeing in panic. Then came Aea, Circe's isle. He told of the grief-stricken landing, the scouting party, and Eurylochus's terrified report. His own journey, the meeting with Hermes and the gift of Moly, was told not as a heroic quest but as a necessary, grim transaction with the divine. The confrontation in the hall, the failed enchantment, the sworn oath, and the restoration of his men were recounted with a strange, detached clarity. He spoke of the year of respite that followed, the feasts, the comfort, the shared bed with the goddess, but his tone carried the ambiguity of that time, a healing that was also a softening, a seduction of the soul as potent as any lotus. The audience could feel the moral weight of that beautiful detention. The necessity of the descent to Hades hung like a pall over the next segment. He gave Circe's instructions, the voyage to the sunless shore, the trench, the libations, the sacrifice. The ghost swarming, Elpenor's plea, and the solemn prophecy of Tiresias were narrated with a quiet, ritual gravity. He shared the prophet's warnings of the sun god's cattle and the suitors in his hall, and the distant promise of a peaceful death. The encounters with his mother, with Agamemnon and Achilles, were summarized not for their drama, but for their lessons on loss, treachery, and the bleakness of the afterlife. This entire episode was framed as a journey to the root of things, a bitter education in fate. He moved then to the sirens. His description of their song was the most lyrical part of his telling, a fleeting glimpse of the sublime temptation, the promise of all knowledge as a form of blissful annihilation. He did not shy from the agony of being bound to the mast, his own begs and orders to be set free, the terror of his crew as they rowed past, deaf to everything but his frantic, wordless struggles. It was a parable of survival through constraint, of choosing life over transcendent truth. Scylla and Charybdis were next. He painted the strait's geography. With dread, the roaring whirlpool, the mist-shrouded cliff, the impossible choice. He admitted he had not warned his men of Scylla fearing panic. The strike of the 6 heads, the snatching of his 6 best sailors, their screams of his name, this he delivered with a stark, unflinching horror. He claimed no victory, only a brutal, calculated loss. The guilt was the point, the cost of passage. Finally, he arrived at Thrinacia. He recounted his fierce warnings, the crew's despairing mutiny, the oath sworn and then broken during the month of contrary winds. The slaughter of the sun god's cattle was described with a solemn, sacrilegious dread, the bellowing meat, the sputtering fires, the men eating in terrified silence. The subsequent departure, the gentle wind, and the fleeting hope were all prelude to the cataclysm. Zeus's thunderbolt, the vaporized ship, the death of every last companion. He narrated this with a hollow finality. His own survival, clinging to the wreckage, drifting back. Through the strait and the 9-day journey to Odyssey was stated as simple, terrible fact. He stopped speaking. The hall was utterly silent. The fire had burned low. He had poured out the journey from the curse to its fulfillment. The act of narration had been a catharsis, a final exorcism. The burden of the tale, carried so long in silence, now resided in the hearts of the Phaeacians. He felt lighter, emptier, as if he had finally laid down a corpse he had been forced to carry for years. The story was told. The road home, at last, lay clear ahead. The silence that followed Odysseus's tale was profound, a shared exhalation held by the entire hall. Then King Alcinous rose. His voice, when it came, was thick with emotion. The Phaeacians, he declared, were a people whose purpose was the safe conveyance of guests. They would not fail in this, their highest calling. He ordered a ship made ready at once, a swift vessel with 52 of his finest oarsmen. To Odysseus he promised more. Then passage. He commanded each of the 12 noble lords present to bring a gift, a tripod, a cauldron, a cloak of finest wool, a talent of precious gold. The hall erupted in murmured agreement, a chorus of generosity for the hero who had endured so much. By dawn, the harbor was a scene of purposeful activity. The chosen ship, sleek and dark-hulled, was dragged to the water. The Phaeacians loaded it not with trade goods, but with a king's ransom in treasure. The gifts were stowed with care. The burnished bronze gleamed dully in the morning light. The folded fabrics gave off a scent of cedar and lavender. Odysseus, bathed and anointed, dressed in fresh garments provided by the queen, stood on the quay. His heart was a tumult of gratitude and anxious impatience. Alcinous and Arid embraced him as a son. Nausicaa, standing apart with her maidens, offered a shy, solemn nod, her part in his salvation complete. As the ship slipped its moorings and the oars dipped into the calm, glassy sea, a profound weariness, deeper than any mere fatigue, settled over Odysseus. It was the weariness of a story finally told, of a burden shared. He stood at the stern, watching Scheria diminish into a green haze on the horizon. The rhythmic pull of the oars was a lullaby. The Phaeacian sailor, skilled beyond mortal measure, drove the ship forward with a speed that made the sea hiss. They required no helm. The vessel knew its course, cutting the waves like a thought toward its destination. Odysseus's eyes grew heavy. The salt air, the steady motion, the release of tension, all conspired against him. He moved to a sheltered spot near the mast, where the crew had piled soft fleeces. He lay down, and before he could mark the sun's position, a deep, enchanted sleep claimed him. It was not a natural rest, but a gift from the Phaeacians, or perhaps the gods. A sleep without dream or memory, a temporary death that healed the fractures of 20 years. The ship flew on, a shadow over the moonlit sea. It never slowed. In the dead of that same night, it entered a familiar, sheltered harbor on Ithaca, a place called Phorcys' Cove. The sailors, moving with silent efficiency, carried the sleeping Odysseus ashore. They laid him gently on a bed of fallen olive leaves in a hidden grotto, placing his magnificent heap of treasure beside him. The bronze, the gold, the fabrics, all carefully arranged by the thoughtful Phaeacians. Without a word, they returned to their ship, pushed off, and turned for home. Their return journey was not to be. Poseidon, whose wrath had cooled but not forgiven, had been waiting. He watched the Phaeacian ship, the instrument of his enemy's deliverance, skimming across his domain. His anger, patient and deep, found its target. As the ship approached Scheria's shadowy cliffs, the god raised his trident. He did not summon a storm. He simply changed the nature of things. The swift, dark hull, the proud work of mortal hands, hardened in an instant. Texture of wood became the texture of stone. The curve of the prow froze. The ship became a rock, a permanent, stark island at the mouth of the harbor, a warning to any who would defy the god of the sea. The sailors, transformed mid-stroke, were saved only by Alcinous's quick remembrance of an old prophecy. He made swift sacrifice, averting total annihilation, but their purpose as conveyors was forever broken. Odysseus awoke to the sound of birdsong. The sun was high, warming his face. He sat up, stiff and disoriented, the deep enchantment slowly lifting. He saw the treasure first, a dazzling, impossible heap that seemed a dream's residue. Then he looked around. He saw a wooded hillside, a sandy cove, a line of unfamiliar trees. The salt scent was there, the sound of waves, but nothing spoke his name. The landscape was beautiful, generic, and utterly alien. A thick gray mist, conjured by the goddess Athena, shrouded every landmark, blurring contours, swallowing distance. He stood, his heart beginning to pound with a slow, cold dread. He was ashore, alive, richer than kings, but he did not know where. After 20 years he was home, and he did not recognize it. The final test, one of the spirit, had begun. He was a king in a beggar's knowledge, a lord in a stranger's land, and the mist around him was the veil between his journey and his destiny. The mist was a physical presence, a damp gray wool that clung to the contours of the land and swallowed sound. Odysseus stood amidst his piled treasure, a king in a phantom kingdom. No landmark pierced the veil, no familiar peak of Neriton, no smoke from his own hearth. A cold, sickening dread coiled in his gut. Had the Phaeacians betrayed him, depositing him on some foreign shore? The weight of 20 years of journeying pressed down, threatening to crush the hope that had sustained him. He scanned the blurry trees, the vague slope of a hill, searching for a crack in the world's anonymity. A figure emerged from the haze, resolving slowly. A young shepherd boy carrying a javelin, driving a flock of fat sheep before him. The boy's face was smooth, untouched by care, his eyes bright with a curious intelligence. Odysseus's wariness, honed by decades of treachery, snapped into place. This was no time for truth. He must be a beggar of stories until he understood where fate had placed him. He approached, his posture bent with a feigned weariness. He spun a tale for the boy, a tapestry of half-truths and invention. He was a Cretan, he said, a fugitive from a blood feud who had killed the son of a great king. He had fled by ship, only to be betrayed by Phoenician traders who had marooned him here while he slept. He gestured vaguely toward the mist-shrouded cove where the Phaeacians' gifts lay hidden. His voice was a practiced instrument of deceit, layered with false regret and calculated humility. He asked the boy with earnest desperation what land this was and who ruled it. The shepherd listened, his head tilted. A smile, too wise for a rustic youth, played upon his lips. Then the air around him shimmered like heat rising from summer stone. The boy's form dissolved, and in his place stood the goddess Athena, tall and gray-eyed, her armor gleaming faintly through the mist. Her laughter was a clear, bright sound that seemed to thin the fog itself. She praised his cunning, the endless, twisting resourcefulness of his mind that not even homecoming could blunt. It was the quality she loved most in him. With a wave of her hand, she dispelled the clinging mist as if brushing aside a curtain. The world snapped into sharp, heart-breaking focus. There was the harbor of Phorcys, its contours known from his youth. There was the path leading up to the town. And there, crowning the hill, was the very olive tree under which he had played as a child. This was Ithaca. The knowledge struck him like a physical blow, a wave of relief so intense it left him trembling. He fell to his knees and kissed the dear, stony earth. Tears of a different order than those shed in Phaeacian hall now soaking into the soil of home. But Athena's news was bitter medicine for his joy. She outlined the ruin in his house, the proud, wasteful suitors over 100 strong, devouring his wealth, courting his wife, plotting against his son. The palace was a fortress held by the enemy. He could not walk in as a king. He must go disguised, a beggar clothed in rags, to test the loyalty of his people and see the depth of the corruption for himself. She told him of the faithful swineherd Eumaeus, who kept his herds in a remote hut on the slopes of Mount Neriton. That would be his first sanctuary. Then the goddess touched him. Her fingers brushed his shoulders, his hair, his skin. He felt a strange internal shrinking, a withering of his heroic frame. His skin grew leathery and lined, his hair thinned and grayed, his strong limbs grew spindly and bowed. His fine Phaeacian clothes transformed into a filthy, tattered tunic. A worn staff appeared in his hand. He looked down at his hands, now the hands of a broken old vagabond, and felt the perfect, terrible completeness of the disguise. It was a prison of flesh, but also a weapon. Athena, her work done, nodded once and was gone, leaving the transformed king alone on the familiar hillside, a stranger in his own skin, staring at the home he must now infiltrate as a suppliant. The final journey, a few miles to a swineherd's hut, was about to begin. The path to the swineherd's steading was a steep, stony track through oak and wild olive, a world away from the palace's remembered grandeur. Odysseus, in his beggar's guise, moved with the slow, pained gait of age, his staff tapping a lonely rhythm on the stones. The hut came into view, a humble compound of fieldstone and timber, surrounded by a stout palisade. Within the yard, 12 stout pens held the prized swine, their contented grunts and the earthy scent of dung a testament to orderly care. 4 fierce dogs, guardians of the flock, lay in the sun, but as the stranger approached, they sprang up with bared teeth, their barking a sudden, savage clamor. From the hut's low doorway, Eumaeus emerged, a sturdy man with a beard grizzled by wind and worry. He shouted at the dogs, seizing a stone to drive them back, his movements brisk with a lifetime of labor. He turned to the beggar, his expression not one of annoyance, but of immediate, practical concern. He berated the dogs for threatening a helpless guest, then welcomed the stranger inside with a gesture that spoke of ingrained hospitality. The hut was simple, a hearth of flat stones, beds of brushwood covered with goatskins, the smoky air rich with the smell of roasting meat. Eumaeus spread fresh goatskins for a seat, urging the old man to rest. He served him without hesitation, a platter of his own finest fare, slices of tender pork from a young boar, and a cup of dark, rustic wine. He apologized for the simplicity, speaking of better days when the true master of the estate would have offered feasts fit for kings. The name of Odysseus fell from his lips with a reverence that was a physical ache in the disguised king's chest. Eumaeus spoke of him not as a lost lord, but as a living presence in his memory, a man of justice and kindness, gone these 20 years, likely food for the fish or birds. His voice thickened with a grief that had not dulled with time. Odysseus, eating the offered food, began his test. He spun a false tale, a mirror of the one he'd told Athena. He claimed to be a Cretan, a veteran of Troy who had heard news of Odysseus, that he was alive, wandering, rich with plunder, and would soon return. He watched the swineherd's face intently. Eumaeus listened patiently, but when the tale was done, he shook his head, a sad, firm finality in his eyes. He had heard such stories before, he said. Wandering beggars and rogues would spin them for a meal and a cloak. He would not have his heart broken again by empty hope. His loyalty was not to a rumor, but to the man he remembered, whose loss he mourned as a son mourns a father. He offered the beggar shelter regardless, for Zeus watches over strangers. That night by the fire's glow, they talked of the lost king. Eumaeus recounted old stories of Odysseus's wisdom in settling disputes, his strength in the hunt, his fairness to his servants. The swineherd's devotion was a rock in the shifting sands of Ithaca's ruin. A flame kept burning in a remote hut, and Odysseus, wrapped in rags and lies, felt a warmth there that his own great hall no longer provided. The dawn that broke over Eumaeus's steading was crisp and clear, the sky washed clean after a night of quiet talk. In the hut, the old beggar and the swineherd stirred the embers of the fire, preparing a simple morning meal. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, and the promise of the day's labor. Yet a subtle tension hummed beneath the routine, a current of anticipation that the swineherd could not name. Odysseus, within his aged disguise, felt it keenly. His senses, sharpened by a lifetime of peril, detected a shift in the world's rhythm, a vibration along the thread of his fate. Far away on the dark wine of the sea, a ship sped toward Ithaca's western shore. Aboard it stood Telemachus, his journey to Pylos and Sparta complete. The wisdom of Nestor and the sorrow of Menelaus were treasures in his mind, but greater still was the warning he carried, of the suitors' ambush plotted in the straits. Guided by an unseen hand, his helmsman avoided the lurking ship, steering instead for a deserted cove far from the palace. As the keel grated on sand, a figure seemed to walk beside Telemachus, a mentor whose advice was always sound. It was Athena, her form invisible, her will a compass in his heart. She urged him to go not directly home, where danger coiled in the great hall, but to the hut of the faithful swineherd. There, she said, he would find news. Thus, as the sun climbed, Telemachus made his way up the familiar mountain paths, his heart heavy with the burden of his house, yet lightened by the goddess's guidance. The dogs in Eumaeus's yard, instead of barking, fawned and whined, tails wagging in silent welcome as the young master approached the gate. Eumaeus, hearing the commotion, dropped the pail he carried and rushed forward. He embraced Telemachus like a long-lost son, weeping tears of joy and relief, for rumors of the suitors' plot had reached even this remote slope. He ushered him into the hut, speaking rapidly of his fears and his hopes. Inside, by the hearth, the old beggar rose slowly from his seat. Odysseus watched his son enter. 20 years had transformed the infant he left into this tall, grave young man, whose eyes held a shadow of his own cunning and a weight of untested sorrow. The sight was a blow to his heart, a mingling of pride and a grief for all the lost years. He made room on a bench, the picture of a respectful, humble stranger. Telemachus, with the innate courtesy Penelope had instilled, greeted the beggar kindly before turning to Eumaeus for news of the palace. Athena, unseen, stood at the threshold of the hut. She caught Odysseus's eye and gave a slight, imperceptible nod. The time was now. As Eumaeus bustled outside to select the finest pig for a feast in his young master's honor, the goddess gestured. She moved her hand not with a flourish, but with a gentle, erasing motion. The illusion of age and poverty fell from Odysseus like a shed skin. The wrinkles smoothed, the bowed spine straightened, the gray hair darkened to its former auburn. His rags seemed to dissolve, replaced by the clean, kingly tunic and the aura of command that had been his at Troy. He was transformed, not into a younger man, but into the man he truly was. The father Telemachus had only known from stories and a single, ghostly memory. Telemachus, turning back from the doorway, stared. His breath caught. He stepped back, his hand flying to where a sword would hang, his mind rejecting the evidence of his eyes. This was a god's trick, a cruel phantom. But Odysseus spoke, his voice now rich and familiar, though trembling with emotion. He called him by name. He spoke of the scar from the boar's tusk on his thigh, a story only a father would know. He spoke of the trees in the courtyard he had planted with lairds. The words were keys turning in long-locked doors. Then Telemachus knew. The disbelief shattered into a wave of feeling so profound it left him wordless. He rushed forward and they embraced, their arms tight around each other, years of absence collapsing into that single, fierce clutch. Tears, hot and unashamed, streamed down both their faces, tears for the lost childhood, for the lonely vigils, for the shared burden of the house's ruin. They wept without sound, the only noise the crackle of the fire and the distant grunting of the swine. It was a reunion not of celebration, but of profound, aching recognition, the joining of two threads of suffering into a single, stronger cord. When they finally drew apart, their faces wet, the practical mind of Odysseus reasserted itself. The moment of emotion was a luxury, the danger remained. In hushed, urgent tones, they began to plot. Odysseus outlined the suitors' numbers, their arrogance. Telemachus reported what he had learned of their plans. A new, hard light of determination shone in the young man's eyes, the light of a son ready to stand beside a father he had never known he needed. Hope, a tangible, fierce thing, was born in the smoky hut, a small, bright flame against the vast darkness of the wrongs waiting to be righted in the palace on the hill. The path from the swineherd's hut to the palace was a descent from honest poverty into the heart of corrupt luxury. Odysseus, once more shrouded in the tattered disguise Athena had woven, walked behind Eumaeus, his staff tapping a feeble rhythm on the familiar stones he now trod as a stranger. The high walls of his own home rose before him, but the sounds that drifted over them were alien, raucous laughter, the discordant plucking of a lyre, the bellowing of men deep in their cups. The air, which should have carried the scent of bread from his kitchens, smelled instead of roasting meat in grotesque excess and spilled wine. They passed through the outer courtyard, where the suitors' servants lounged, casting dismissive glances at the swineherd and his ragged companion. The great doors of the Megaron stood open, revealing a scene that froze the blood in Odysseus's veins. His hall, the place of ordered feasts and just judgments, was a den of waste and arrogance. Young lords of Ithaca and surrounding islands sprawled on hides not their own, their tables groaning with joints of his own fattened cattle and swine. They diced for gold with careless hands, their faces flushed, their voices loud with a confidence born of impunity. Serving. Girls, his own maids, moved among them with trays of bread and wine, some with eyes downcast in shame, others with bold, complicit smiles. Eumaeus led the beggar to the threshold, seeking a place for him within. But the suitor's eyes, ever hungry for sport, found the new target. A hail of insults began, coarse and mocking, questioning the swineherd's judgment in bringing such filth into their presence. One, a particularly vicious man from same named Cyclops, seized a cow's hoof from a basket and hurled it. It struck Odysseus on the shoulder with a dull thud. The disguised king rocked with the blow but did not stumble. He absorbed the impact in silence, his head bowed, a vessel filling with a cold, precise rage. He observed it all, the suitor's casual cruelty, the wanton consumption of his stores, the arrogant disregard for all law of host and guest. This was not just theft, it was a systematic unraveling of the world's order, a feast on the corpse of his kingship. From her chambers, above, Penelope heard the commotion. The arrival of a stranger, even a beggar, was news. She summoned Eumaeus, who came to her quietly, leaving Odysseus sitting just inside the door, a silent, watchful shadow. The queen, her face beautiful but worn thin by 20 years of grief and guile, asked about the newcomer. Eumaeus spoke of the old man's noble bearing beneath his rags, of a patience that seemed more than mere submission. A spark, faint but persistent, kindled in Penelope's weary heart. She requested that the beggar be brought to her later. She wished to question him, for wanderers often carried news, fragments of a wider world that might, by some miracle, contain word of her lord. In the great hall below, the suitors' laughter swelled, a wave of hubris crashing against the quiet, patient resolve of the king in rags and the queen in her guarded room, the tension winding tighter with every wasted morsel and every scornful laugh. Penelope descended from her shadowed chamber into the smoky tumult of the hall, a figure of grave stillness moving through a sea of riot. The suitors' clamor hushed momentarily, not in respect, but in the avaricious appreciation of hunters observing prized game. She ignored them, her gaze finding the ragged beggar seated by the door. She spoke to him with a weary courtesy that was itself a rebuke to the room's coarseness. She invited him to sit nearer the hearth, a place of honor, and asked for his story. Who was he? From what land did he hail? Had he, in his wanderings, ever heard word of Odysseus? Her voice, as she recounted her own grief, was low and measured, a stark contrast to the hall's din. She spoke of the shroud for Laertes, her famous trick, weaving by day, unraveling by night, a 3-year deception of hope and exhaustion that had finally been betrayed by a faithless maid. The memory was not of cleverness, but of a desperate, lonely holding action against a tide of pressure. She described the suitors, not with anger, but with a profound, tired contempt for their consumption and their constant, bullying suit. Her steadfastness was not the stuff of ballads, but the slow, daily resistance of a woman whose only weapon was patient refusal. Odysseus, wrapped in his beggar's skin, listened. The sight of her, older, lined with care, yet radiant with an undimmed nobility, struck him with a force greater than any storm. Her words were a mirror held up to his own 20 years of struggle, reflecting a different, silent war fought on the home front. He was moved beyond the capacity of his disguise, a fierce, protective love tightening his throat. He mastered himself and began to weave his false tale. He was a Cretan, a brother of the late King Idomeneus, he said. He had entertained Odysseus in his own halls years ago on the hero's voyage to Troy. He spoke of his guest's keen mind and strong presence. Then, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, he added the crucial thread. He had heard, very recently, that Odysseus was alive. He was gathering riches in the Sprotia and would return, perhaps by the next new moon. He swore it by Zeus of the hearth before which they sat. Penelope listened, her eyes searching his weathered face. Hope, that most treacherous of guests, stirred painfully within her. She longed to believe, but 20 years had schooled her in disappointment. She thanked him, her tone gracious but guarded, and ordered her maids to prepare a bath and a proper bed for the stranger. It was then she called for the old nurse, Eurycleia, to wash the beggar's feet, an act of kindness that would seal his welcome. Eurycleia, who had nursed Odysseus from infancy, brought a polished basin and warm water. She knelt, her old bones creaking, and took the beggar's foot in her hands. As she worked, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of ankle and shin, she found it, a long white scar above the knee, the legacy of a boar's tusk from a hunt on Mount Parnassus in his youth. Her hands froze. Her eyes traveled up from the scar to the beggar's face, her mind piecing together the noble bearing, the patient silence, the timbre of a voice heard in 1,000 childhood echoes. Recognition dawned, a shock that stole her breath. The basin tipped, spilling water across the floor with a clatter. In an instant, Odysseus's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. His eyes, burning through the disguise, locked onto hers. He pulled her close, his voice a low, venomous hiss only she could hear. He swore her to silence, invoking the very gods of the household. If she breathed a word, if she betrayed him before the time was right, he would show her no mercy, nurse or not. He would kill her alongside the treacherous maids. The threat was absolute, a cold blade of necessity. Eurycleia, her heart pounding, nodded mutely, the joy of recognition instantly alloyed with terror. She finished her task in trembling silence, the secret now a burning coal in her chest, while the suitors, oblivious, continued their feasting, their doom washing unknowingly over the feet of the king they mocked. The morning after the foot washing, a strange, charged stillness settled over the palace. Penelope descended from her chamber, her face a mask of weary resolve. In her hands she carried a great bronze key, and behind her came 2 serving men bearing a massive object swathed in ox hide. They moved to the center of the hall, where the suitors lounged amid the wreckage of their breakfast. With a clear voice that cut through the murmur, Penelope announced her decision. The time for waiting was over. She would marry the man who could string the bow of her lord Odysseus and shoot an arrow through the sockets of 12 axe heads, set in a line as he once did in his youth. It was a contest of rightful strength, a final test. The ox hide was drawn back. There lay the bow, a great curve of polished horn and wood, untouched for 20 years. A collective intake of breath filled the room. It was a weapon of legend, a king's weapon, its beauty severe and deadly. The suitors' eyes gleamed with avaricious confidence. One by one they stepped forward. The strongest among them seized the bow, planted its tip against the floor, and strained to bend it. His face purpled with effort, the veins standing out on his forehead. The bow remained unbent, a mocking arc of resistance. Another tried, and another. They warmed the horn by the fire, they greased it with lard, they cursed and heaved. Their soft, feasting hands could not master the weapon of the warrior king. Laughter turned to grunts of frustration, then to sullen silence as failure piled upon humiliating failure. From his place by the door, the ragged beggar watched, a faint, cold light in his eyes. When the last proud lord had staggered back, defeated, he spoke. His voice was quiet but carried. He asked, with a humility that was itself a provocation, if he might try his hand. The hall erupted in derisive laughter. They mocked his age, his poverty, his impudence. Antinous, the most vicious, threatened to have him dragged out and burned. But Penelope, from her seat, intervened. The bow was hers to offer, and the stranger was a guest. Let him try. If he failed, he would earn only scorn, but he had the right. Telemachus, with a calm authority that surprised the room, supported her. He then rose, and with a meaningful glance at Eumaeus and another loyal cowherd, moved to secure the great doors of the hall, sliding the heavy bars into place. The suitors, too absorbed in their ridicule, barely noticed. The beggar stood. He walked to the bow, his movements shedding their feigned frailty with each step. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, testing its weight and balance as a musician tunes an instrument. He walked to the threshold into the light, ignoring the taunts. Then, with an effort that seemed not of muscle but of pure, focused will, he bent the bow. He did not strain, he commanded. The horn groaned, then yielded, the string snapping into place with a sound like a plucked harp of death. The laughter in the hall died instantly, strangled in 100 throats. Before the silence could break, he took an arrow from the quiver, knocked it, and drew the string to his ear. His form was the form of a master, etched against the daylight. He aimed down the line of 12 axe heads, their sockets gleaming. He released. The arrow flew with a hiss, a streak of polished wood and bronze. It passed clean through the first socket, and the second, and the third, through all 12 in a single, impossible flight, and thudded into the far wall, quivering. The shot was not just skill, it was an act of reclamation. In that fluid, powerful motion, the disguise fell away. He was no longer a beggar, but a king returned, a force of vengeance made manifest. His identity was revealed not by words, but by that single, perfect, terrible action. The hall was frozen, a tableau of shock and dawning terror, as Odysseus turned his gaze upon the suitors. The unstrung bow now a scepter in his hands, and the reckoning began. The silence after the arrow's flight was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the breath from every throat. Then Odysseus shed his rags. He did not merely remove them. He cast them off like a second skin, standing revealed in the hearthlight. The king in his own hall, his body hardened by decades of toil, his eyes burning with a cold fire 20 years in the forging. He nodded to Telemachus, who stood by the barred doors, and to the 2 loyal servants, Eumaeus and Philotius, who moved to flank their master. The suitors stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the despised beggar with the living legend before them. The first to break the spell was Antinous, who was raising a golden cup to his lips. Odysseus's next arrow took him in the throat, punching through the soft flesh. The cup clattered to the floor, wine mingling with the dark blood that fountained from his mouth. He fell backward, choking, the leader's life extinguished in a gurgle. Chaos erupted. The suitors scrambled from their couches, overturning tables, searching frantically for weapons that were not there, for Odysseus had seen to their removal. Their arrogance shattered into raw, animal panic. Eurymachus, the next in influence, tried to plead, to blame Antinous, to offer restitution in bronze and gold. Odysseus's answer was a smile devoid of warmth. "Your time for paying is now," he said, and let fly another arrow that found Eurymachus's chest. The battle was joined. It was not a fight, but a harvest. Odysseus, Telemachus, and the 2 herdsmen, armed with spears and swords from the hidden stash, fell upon the trapped men. The air filled with the screams of the dying, the clash of bronze, the sickening thud of blades finding flesh. Athena was there, not as a visible goddess, but as a shift in the air, a luck that turned aside desperate throes, a strength that fortified the arms of the 4 avengers. She appeared to Odysseus as a mentor, her shield flickering at the edge of his vision, guiding his strikes. To the suitors, she was a terror, a shape of mist that confused their blows and magnified their fear. The hall became a slaughter pen. Men who had spent years in soft indulgence fell before the hardened skill of the warrior and the furious righteousness of his son. They fought back in clusters, hurling stools, seizing firebrands from the hearth, but their efforts were disjointed, frantic. Odysseus moved among them like a force of nature, his every stroke precise, a final, cathartic release of 2 decades of pent-up rage and injustice. Telemachus fought at his side, no longer a boy, but a man claiming his birthright with blood. When the last suitor lay still, the hall fell silent, a stark contrast to the cacophony of moments before. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of the 4 victors and the low moan of the dying. Then Odysseus turned his gaze to the disloyal maidservants who had warmed the beds of his enemies and mocked Penelope's grief. He ordered them to clean the hall of the dead, a cruel parody of their service. When that was done, he had them taken to the courtyard. With a length of ship's cable, Telemachus, his face set in grim lines, fashioned a noose. He threw the rope over a high beam, and one by one, the faithless women were hanged, their bodies twitching in the twilight, a terrible judgment for their betrayal. The final act was for Melanthius, the goat-herd who had aided the suitors. They cut off his nose and ears, tore out his genitals, and fed them to the dogs, a raw, archaic vengeance. Then it was over. The great hall of Odysseus was still. The reek of blood and death lay heavy over the splintered tables and overturned finery, a metallic scent that overpowered the lingering smells of wine and roasted meat. The hearth fire crackled, its light dancing on the vacant eyes of the dead and the weary, blood-spattered faces of the living. 20 years of wandering, of loss, of insult, had culminated in this brutal, necessary silence. The justice was absolute, terrible, and complete. The house was cleansed with iron and blood, and in the echoing quiet, the long road's final turning was at hand. The silence after the slaughter was a living thing, thick with the scent of iron and spent rage. Odysseus stood amidst the ruin of his hall, his chest heaving, the weight of the bow still in his hands. He ordered the loyal servants to clear the dead, to scrub the stained floors with water and sponge, to burn sulfur to cleanse the air. The work was done with a grim efficiency, the palace slowly reverting from a charnel house to a home, though the ghosts of the slain seemed to linger in the smoke. Only when the last body was dragged out and the last pool of blood washed away did he turn his thoughts inward, to the chamber above where Penelope waited, her vigil unbroken through the terrible sounds from below. He bathed, scrubbing the gore from his skin, anointing himself with oil. Athena restored his noble form, the vigor of his prime, his hair dark again, his bearing that of a king. Yet when he entered the great hall, now quiet and ordered, he did not go to Penelope as a conqueror. He sat by the hearth, the place of the stranger, and waited. He understood her caution was the twin of his own cunning, a fortress that could not be stormed. She descended, her face pale but composed, and sat across from him in the carved chair that had been his father's. She studied him, her eyes searching for the man within the hero's frame. The stories of the beggar, the trial of the bow, the slaughter, all could be a trick of the gods, a final, cruel deception. She spoke first, her voice steady. She ordered the old nurse to move the great bed from their bridal chamber for their guest. Odysseus's head snapped up. A cold fury, deeper than any he had felt for the suitors, flashed in his eyes. He described the bed, its secret known only to them. how he had built their room around a living olive tree, its trunk hewn into a post, its roots deep in the earth. The bed was immovable, carved from that living heart, a testament of their union. To move it would be to kill the tree, to sever the symbol of their rooted love. At her words, Penelope's composure shattered. The final test, more potent than any contest of strength, had been passed. The secret, held in silence for 20 years, was the key that unlocked her heart. A cry broke from her, a sound of release so profound it was beyond tears. She ran to him, her arms encircling his neck, and they clung to each other as if the sea itself were trying to tear them apart. No words were needed. The decades of separation, the loneliness, the fears, dissolved in that wordless embrace. They wept, their tears mingling, washing away the salt of different oceans, his of the deep, hers of silent interior sorrow. Later, in the quiet of their chamber, with the olive wood post solid beside them, they talked through the night. The dawn was slow in coming, as if granting them this stolen time. He spoke, not in the formal cadence of the storyteller, but in fragments, the gray loneliness of the sea, the hollow horror of the Cyclops' cave, the haunting song of the sirens, the guilt of Scylla, the despair of Odyssey. She listened, her hand in his, and told her own tale. The slow siege of the suitors, the weaving and unweaving, the constant pressure, the nurturing of Telemachus' spirit in a house of wolves. Their stories wove together, two threads of endurance finally twisted into a single, unbreakable cord. As the first true light of dawn gilded the edges of the world, they stood together on the threshold, looking out over the courtyard toward the Ithacan hills, now emerging from the night's shadow. The journey was complete, not just the miles of ocean, but the longer road through loss, through memory, through the preservation of self against every temptation to forget. He was home, not to a place, but to a recognition. The wanderer and the watcher were united, the circle closed. The long road had ended here in the quiet of a shared dawn, with the scent of the earth and the distant murmur of the sea, a sound now of peace, not promise. They turned together and went inside, closing the door on the past, and the house at last was still.